One winter evening, something strange happened in a wooden hut in the middle of the forest. The young man's glass of red drink fell to the ground, and he began to cover his mouth with his hands. This poison does not allow mana to circulate through the blood vessels. The man standing opposite said that the poison would take full effect in a few minutes and added another type of poison especially for him. The victim asked the gentleman why he had done it. The man, in turn, listened with a serious expression, and a second later, he asked if the blonde, long-haired man really didn't understand. He said that the United Empire no longer needed his power. He added that wartime was over and that this force was only causing problems now. The man who said this was dressed in a beautiful military suit. The soldier reminded his interlocutor of the words he had said earlier. "I will return to the village where I will live peacefully for the rest of my life, so as not to become the cause for the last time." The astonished blonde gentleman listened to these words with wide open eyes, and there was a red consistency around his mouth. That's why he said he wanted to wash the blood off his hands, and he also wants to live his life pretending that he doesn't exist. And he asked a clarifying question. Is it normal to be afraid of your own friend? After all, he is an 8th-level sorcerer. Any moment can destroy him and the Empire. For this reason, he has no right to keep such a monster alive. After saying these words, the man turned to face the door and began to walk slowly toward it, while his friend followed him. And as soon as he entered the room, fire appeared around the long-haired man, from which it would be difficult for him to escape. Then the gentleman put his right hand on his chest and said to himself with a slight grimace. However, the long-haired blonde pulled out a small sword from inside his jacket, which he always kept with him just in case. And, in his opinion, it was Ragnar who was more trusting, because every day he lived was filled with regret. Before the poison spreads completely, he will still be able to use magic for his own purposes, and this gesture could be his repentance. But as soon as he pierced himself, bright red blood poured out of his mouth and down his beard. A few seconds later, a blue light began to appear around the man, and he said with the last of his strength, "Ra, hus, Akiro." A strange, large drawing appeared on the floor around the exhausted gentleman, which was also illuminated with blue light. However, having gained strength, the blonde raised his head high and shouted loudly. That's why we see the same gentleman standing in a cemetery a few years ago next to a grave he already knew, his head bowed down. And then he moved to the castle, where he bowed to an older man with a long stick and a young soldier. After that, he became a grown man who grew long blonde hair and had his own personal cane. Suddenly, the young man quickly got out of bed and covered his mouth with his hand. However, he still did not fully understand what had happened. So he got to his feet and realized that the pain had disappeared and the wounds had gone with it. And at that very second, someone called out in a gentle voice to a boy named Ian, and he turned his head to see who it was. It turns out that she was a beautiful young woman with long, thick, wavy hair. But the appearance of this lady surprised the boy because it was his mother who had been dead for several years. And he immediately began to stroke his mother's hand, and the thought flashed through his mind that his plan had succeeded. However, there is another option, that he died and met her in the afterlife. A few meters away, there was a small settlement where a group of people were talking. When the young man took a closer look, he noticed that the children were lining up one by one to be tested, and the soldiers of the army carefully control the crowd, indicating who should go through next. On the tent, the young man noticed an ivory-colored flag fluttering in the wind. At the age of 12, all children of the Green River Empire are tested. This procedure helps to identify the wizards who will become the pillars of imperial power. The second quality, mana of the heart, is responsible for the creation, circulation, and storage of mana. And then he realized that going back 30 years was too far. Still, he managed to use the magic of time, which he spent his life studying, killing his enemies in the name of devotion, the price for which was death. However, once he got here, everything will be different in this life. That's why you need to act to realize your plans. He approached one of the soldiers and told him that he was Ian Page from the village of Mogrian. The man smiled sweetly and mentioned that he was Vanessa's son. He told him he could come in, but not to bombard the sorcerer with questions. The gentleman who was conducting the test was already very tired, so he asked Knight Aaron if he had many more children. And at that very moment, a young man opened the white curtain to the room, apologized, and slowly entered. The inspecting man gathered himself in his emotions and showed the robot a smile and said hello. When the boy approached, the gentleman said that he was going to check his head, namely, to send some mana to his head. A second later, He added that this was a standard procedure. Then the man asked the boy to turn his back. For a few seconds, the child froze, not knowing what to expect. Smiling sweetly, the gentleman told him to come back as soon as possible because he had a trace of mana in his brain. However, you also need to feel the mana in your heart. After all, just going to a magic academy is not enough. However, the young man interrupted this inspection by addressing the sorcerer and offering to show him something. A second later, he said he would demonstrate it first. A drop of water appeared on his other palm, and the sorcerer realized that the young man had used a double spell. The guy said that he actually started to do it recently. However, everyone was already on their feet because what they had just seen in front of them was not something they had ever seen before. And the chief sorcerer, with wide open eyes and mouth, loudly asked, "What?" I immediately asked if the young man had ever practiced this before. The blonde answered quickly and clearly that he had never practiced it. The blonde man was already a little angry, and a blue light began to appear in his eyes. And now the sorcerer is going to use the magic of mind reading, and it helps to sense lies. So the man suggested that I think about it and answer again. A second later, he added that he, his family, and even his neighbors would lose their heads. However, the boy looked down and shook his head in a calm tone and replied that there was no point in lying. The sorcerer folded his arms over his chest after these words. It was very funny to hear these words from a child. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard saying impatiently that the child had told the truth. All those present turned their heads to the curtain through which they could enter the room. A minute later, the young man angrily approached the curtain and pulled it aside to see his mother. A man grabbed her arm. She, in turn, began to shout loudly for him to stop because it was causing her a lot of pain. Then the gentleman smiled sweetly and emphasized that the lady had been a widow for 7 years and had stopped pretending to be cheap because she didn't mind. The woman was surprised and said, "What does he think he's doing?" Because she still doesn't understand what he wants from her. 3 men came out of the room at the noise. One mustached gentleman standing in the middle asked what was going on. The guard continued to hold the young lady by one shoulder and replied that it was nothing. The word low grade made the young man very angry because no one has the right to call his mother that. However, one of the men came up to the boy and put his hand on his shoulder to calm him down a bit. Then the gentleman said that they found out that this boy had 2 qualities that a sorcerer needs, and an attack on this stratum of the people is punishable very severely. They will be charged with treason and punished without trial. When the guard realized what was about to happen, he quickly put his hands up and said, "Oh," so he decided to act quickly. He fell on the ground in front of the young man and began to apologize, saying that he did not mean to and that there was a misunderstanding. However, the boy calmly said that why was the gentleman apologizing to him when he should be apologizing to his mother? The guard slowly raised his head and looked up and said, "Oh." He realized that he had said a lot of bad words to this young lady. However, he had no other option, so he quickly knelt down and bowed his head down. The woman did not know what to do, so she turned her head to her son and said his name with a confused expression. However, the young man did not give any answer, but instead approached the accused and knelt down on one knee in front of him so that he would listen attentively. And he began to say that he actually knew what people like him could think about people like his mother. And the blonde continued to say that the man should tell his friends everything he had heard, seen, and felt today in color. And after the boy blinked his eyes, the color of his pupils changed to blue, and he added that he would follow this gentleman in the future. Sweat began to appear on the guard's face from excitement, and all he could say was that he understood everything and thanked him for not being punished. Then the boy got to his feet and approached the gentleman who was checking for mana and sincerely thanked him for his help. The blond man smiled sweetly and replied that the tower must protect its wizards no matter what it costs, because people should not be so impudent. After that, he turned to one of the other soldiers and asked him to make sure that the boy was okay and safe. The mustachioed man turned his head to the young man and his mother and asked if they agreed to take them to the hotel where their knights were staying. The boy and his mother looked at each other and agreed, because they had no other choice, because unfortunately, they had nowhere to go back to. The blond boy returned to the sorcerer and asked for permission to go to rest, because he was very tired and wanted to talk to his mother to calm her down. When the guests finally went to the resting place, they were gazed at by the inspector, who folded his arms across his chest and thought that this young man had a very good ability for such a young age, and he is simply sure that he will cause a lot of noise in the ivory tower. At this late hour, the security guard was returning home. He threw his jacket over one shoulder and was very upset. And he was also quite angry that the son of some cook was talking to him like that, because he was just a boy, and the gentleman was a grown man. How could he humiliate him like that, in front of his mother? So he kept saying to himself that he would show this young man where the crayfish hide. And then the guard froze in place. He was quite frightened, because this had never happened to him before. A man's voice sounded behind him, saying that the gentleman was immobilized and emphasizing that magic was capable of even that. Slowly taking off his hood, the blonde reminded me that he had warned me that he would be watching the guard. A second later, he continued to say that today this man was humiliated by the cook's boyfriend, and because of this, he decided to pour alcohol over his grief. Looking down from the bridge, the young man said that his entire past life was devoted to learning spells in the language of dragons. However, this turned out to be impossible, and his hands will never be cleaned of the blood of the victims. His only dream now is to protect his loved ones, and for this, he will do anything, even if new blood keeps getting his hands dirty. As the young man looked at the body of his victim floating in the river, he remembered his "please don't forgive me." When he returned home, he sat down by the door and leaned his head against it, closing his eyes, because he had a bad headache and felt as if he was going to break down. After a little rest, the young man decided to go inside, where he saw his mother sleeping peacefully on a small bed. And as he looked at her beautiful, calm face, he thought that after only a year of studying at the Magical Academy, he had been recognized as a first-class wizard. And it was in that year that the mother who stayed in the village became very ill and died, and she was never able to see her son, who became a wizard. So he quietly walked closer to the bed and mentally promised himself that this time he would protect her, no matter what it took. He will also try to make her happier, because now it is not clear that she has ever enjoyed this life. And my mother will finally be able to live a long life. After all, the loss of loved ones that he suffered in his past life will not happen in this one. Then the events unfold in the capital of Trin River, which is called Trinverium. At this time, a mustachioed blonde man, who was the emperor, named Terry Trin River, was sitting in the middle. The owner of the tower was a 5th-ranked sorcerer named Harriet Leon, and he held a stick in his hand and answered, "Mana circulates through the vessels. A person becomes a sorcerer when he understands how to control it at will." The man went on to emphasize that this is usually taught at the academy, and his current state corresponds to the first class, as it was with the first sorcerer. The mustachioed blonde man folded his arms across his chest with a serious expression and repeated the words, "the first sorcerer," and asked whether this creature descended from dragons. This makes it difficult to believe the words of the people conducting the inspection. Therefore, you need to verify this personally. Because of this, he can say for sure that in any case, the boy's strength is dangerous. The mustachioed gentleman listened attentively and continued to sit. Suddenly, someone knocked lightly on the door, and the man invited the prince, who was also his son, to come inside. The boy was the heir to this empire. His name was Hayden Trin River. The gentleman replied that he had called and apologized that he had to wait a bit to meet him. The young man then put his right hand on the lump and asked with a confused expression why he had come here. Then his father emphasized in a serious tone that the last time the boy had left the castle was 5 years ago. The young blonde was surprised and frightened by this decision. So he asked in shock, "Outside the castle?" The man replied confidently that it would be so, but he would send 2 of his knights, 300 soldiers, and 3 third-class sorcerers with him. After listening attentively, the son froze for a few seconds, and then asked who the young man was, with his mouth wide open. And then the father realized that perhaps his son hadn't heard anything, so he immediately asked them to forget all of the above. However, the young man did not like this development, and continued to hold his hand on his chest, and said that the man could rely on him. When my father heard these words, he slowly began to rise to his feet, but for some reason, he did not say a word for several minutes. Then he sat back down in his soft chair and said that the boy could start preparing for the trip, because he would have to go north, and it might take a while. When the son left, the chief of the tower reappeared in the room and addressed His Majesty and asked for the opportunity to leave as well. The gentleman looked down and replied that everyone knows that wizards do not like long journeys, so they will need to be convinced. The mustachioed man closed his eyes and calmly allowed his subordinate to leave and go to fulfill his task. So the gray-haired gentleman with the stick quickly left the room to go to his wards and try to fulfill the task he had been given. At the door, the man was met by his servant, who bowed slightly and asked if he was returning. At this time, Morning came to the hotel where the sorcerer's boy and his mother were checked in. But despite this, the young man was already sitting on the edge of his bed, thinking that he would soon hear back from the tower and the castle. And then I remembered a picture of the inspector talking about his capabilities. And everything goes according to plan. Namely, the emperor is lining up sorcerers to put them in charge of the prince's follower, and the boy can join the emperor or the owner of the tower, or he can choose a third party. A lot of people from the ward that conducted the inspection had already gathered outside. The sorcerer was told that he could start doing what he had come here to do. After that, it was said that the imperial sorcerer Ian Page was being called upon to fulfill the emperor's order. But after stopping for a second, he repeated the word order to himself. Something about it made him uneasy and surprised, and they came unexpectedly quickly. So the young man had no choice but to open the door and see who it was that came to see him. It turned out that it was a black-haired gentleman who was conducting the inspection. He was holding a blue ball in his left hand, and smiling sweetly, he emphasized that the young man had come out just in time. The blonde man did not understand why this was happening, because in his head he had envisioned a completely different scenario. Then he was ordered to get down on his right knee and raise his left hand to his heart. Then the man held out his blue orb, from which a voice spoke to Ian Page and asked him to listen to the order. I, the Emperor, recognize Ian Page's talent and officially order his name to be added to the Ivory Tower's magical register. In addition to this, I invite you to visit the Imperial Castle and send a follower, Prince, to accompany Ian on my behalf. The other guards approached the inspector and asked if this was the whole order and if they had to escort the guy to the local castle. Therefore, one of the guards approached the young man and put his hand on his chest and told him that he was a captain of Mogrian's army and his name was Arnold, and they will leave as soon as the boy is ready to travel. The lord of the Mogrian province, whose name was Marcus Mogrilli, looked ahead of him and announced that their guests had finally arrived. The man then turned his head to the right and addressed two people named Ravi and Margaret to get their attention, that a sorcerer should be treated with respect. At this time, Ian and his mother got out of the carriage that approached the castle. As the three guests approached the man who met them, the people reasoned that if the emperor himself was interested, then this young man had special powers. The gray-haired gentleman held out both hands and greeted his guests. The blond young man stood there looking at everything for a few seconds. In the afternoon, one of the cleaners asked the other if she had seen the new guy at practice. He is an amazing talent, and he trains so hard on any vacation. I had to spend a lot of time a day using my powers to use magic. Today, he was practicing a freezing spell, and as soon as he succeeded, a blue and white light appeared around him. After that, white ice and snow appeared around the boy. This time, everything turned out much better and faster. What the young man didn't like was that he could use magic to make some of this ice and snow disappear. After all, in his previous body, he could freeze an entire castle, not just one training field. These thoughts were interrupted by a mustachioed man who walked quickly toward him and called out to him, calling him Mr. Sorcerer, and when he came closer, he asked for help. The young man asked in surprise what exactly he could do to help. And then the confused man frightenedly said that the Lord had disappeared and no one could find him. This news surprised the blond man himself. He opened his eyes and mouth wide and repeated the words, "Gone, gone." The man went on to say that the Lord had gone on a goblin hunt and had not returned. His bodyguards and Mr. Ravi had also disappeared. After listening carefully, the young man emphasized in his mind that it was still too early for this gentleman to die. I also remembered that the great Lord Marcus Mogrian would die at the hands of an assassin from a hostile country shortly before the First War of Unification. After these reflections, the young man took his right hand aside and asked in surprise why he was being asked to do this, and not the sorcerer Marco. However, everyone knew that the Lord had loved hunting in his previous life, so it was unlikely that anything could have happened to him. Again, this was a bit of a surprise, because as a responsible sorcerer, he left the settlement to which he was introduced. And then the blonde realizes that a magician is usually allowed to leave a certain province only in rare cases. But he has the most important weapon, knowledge from the future, because he has already lived a similar life, so he only needs to choose to repeat it or change the course of events. However, he knows that he may lose his favor. However, they have no one else to turn to. And finally, he stopped in a confident pose with his hands down and said that he would find the Lord and put a lot of effort into saving him. After all, he needs to put everything back in its place. The young man came to the hotel to pack a few things to take with him on his search. Coming closer to her son, the young lady said that she had heard that he was going to find a lord. The woman went on to clarify whether it was too dangerous, because in her opinion, he was too young for such things. After saying these words, the son came up to his mother, took her hands, and told her not to worry, because he would definitely return, and they would continue to spend time together. Suddenly, this conversation was interrupted by a girl who quickly entered the room and apologized. The lady was very upset, and asked us to find her brother and father with tears in her eyes. Then she folded her hands in prayer and added that if the young man succeeded, she would ask her father to give him money, land, and servants. So, the guy decided not to listen to what this young lady was going to say, and interrupted her speech, saying that he would find her family. However, he asked her to give him her ring, because in it he could feel the mana that he might need during the search. The girl asked if she could help with the search. The guy answered that, of course. When he looked at the jewelry on his hand, he realized that it was quite familiar. It was Mogrian's wedding ring. It is a lower-class artifact that increases the mana of the wearer. But then he asked how the Lord gave it to his daughter instead of his heir. And finally, she added that he shouldn't forget to return the ring, because her father had entrusted it to her. Then the boy approached the guards and said that they could go in search of the Lord and his son. An hour later, the young man and his assistants found themselves in a dense forest. The head guard said that they had finally arrived, and they noticed that this is where the trail ended. The blonde asked if they had found the victims. The young man began to think. It was obvious because he bowed his head down and put his hand to his chin. Because of this, he had to find the Lord before it was too late, and he began to use magic to summon the wolf spirit to help him. While the young man was using force, his assistant stood behind him, silently watching everything that was happening. But there were two craftsmen who were surprised and began to talk to each other to clarify, saying, "Wolf?" However, it was not a large adult wolf that appeared before them, but rather a small wolf cub. Everyone was surprised by who they saw in front of them. That's why the clearing was silent for a few seconds. And in the blonde man's mind, he thought that in his past life, this animal was bigger. And then the young man realized that his current supply of mana did not allow him to make larger sizes. When the animal began to move to the right, the sorcerer's assistants turned to him because they did not understand what they had to do. At this time, the blonde man is still in an unknown location. The goblin was attacking the man by swinging his weapon from a tree. It turns out that he attacked a lord, who managed to defeat him and cut off his head with his sword. The gentleman stopped for a few seconds to rest, and then he realized that the goblins had a lot of them, and it was not clear what to do to win and stay alive. As the beasts watched the lord, they became angrier and angrier. They realized that there were several dozen more of them, and so everyone wanted to fight at least a little. The Lord closed his eyes to avoid seeing these animals and said to himself that he was going to die anyway, so it didn't matter whether he fought to the end. So the man turned his head to his son and said that he would try to detain the attackers and that he, in turn, should return to the castle. The boy did not expect to hear such a request, and when he returned, he had to tell everyone that there were many goblins on Mount Mogrian and it was very dangerous. However, the young man stood there like a stone, because he did not want to leave his father alone. Because of this, he turned to his father to ask him again and tell him that it was a very bad idea, in his opinion, because to be left alone with these animals is to die in a few minutes. While the Lord was listening to this, one of the goblins quietly crept up behind him, and he had already made a swing. The son saw this and began to shout loudly to his father, telling him what was happening behind him. So the man quickly turned his head to assess the situation himself. After all, he was used to relying on himself in any battle or fight. However, for some reason, he did not run away to save himself. Instead, he froze in place, and a blue and white light began to appear around him. You could already see in the Lord's eyes that he had accepted the fact that he was going to die. But as soon as he noticed that everything around him had changed its color, he began to consider who could have done it. He wondered if someone had found them and if they would survive. A few meters from the battlefield, a blond man walked slowly and confidently. He managed to find the right people and use the magic he had been practicing for weeks. This time, however, he did much better because there were large ice mountains near him. The young man turned back a little to see and assess the situation, and then the Lord realized that the boy who had arrived at their castle a few months earlier had come to save them. This surprised him because he had not expected to see this particular young man here. Further events unfold in the castle. A young lady was sitting on a chair by the bedside and quietly calling out to her father, who was lying unconscious in bed at the time. The man began to slowly get up, holding his head, which still hurt. He asked himself what happened. After all, he didn't really remember anything, especially how he got back to the castle. The daughter saw her father alive and began to cry, saying that Ian had saved them. She said that her father and Ravi had been unconscious for 2 days, and because of this, she was very worried. At that moment, a mustachioed gentleman came into the room and said that he was very happy that the master had finally regained consciousness. For everyone in the castle was in a state of excitement. The Lord made himself comfortable on the bed and asked what happened to the other participants. He was curious about what happened when the blonde sorcerer joined them. The aide bowed his head down and said that 12 soldiers and the knight Rothan had failed to return. After these words, the room fell silent, because everyone felt sorry for the dead. Then the man asked where the sorcerer was, and the mustachioed gentleman said that he would bring him here in a moment. The young man was found on the training field and told that the Lord wanted to see him. But first he asked if the Lord was all right, and whether it was necessary to postpone their meeting until a little later so that he could rest and gain strength. The mustachioed gentleman, smiling sweetly, said that the Lord was alive and well. That's why he asked me to come to his bedroom to discuss certain details in private. The blonde froze for a few seconds, as he was a little worried about what exactly would be discussed. After all, he was not yet ready to answer any uncomfortable questions. However, when the young man came to the Lord, he was already dressed in his usual clothes, and on his right side stood his son, whose left cheek was taped. The man invited the guests to come in. The guy asked them how they were feeling, smiling sweetly. He wanted to know that first, so he wouldn't start with something he didn't want to talk about. The Lord replied that it was all thanks to the sorcerer, so he would like to personally express his gratitude for their rescue. After all, he literally saved the present and future of the Mogrian family. He also cleared Mount Mogrian of goblins. Because of this, the Lord cannot ignore such an act. During these words, the man put his right hand on his heart to demonstrate the sincerity of his words. Then he reached for a small wooden box that was lying on the table and handed it to the blonde and asked him to open it. The young man began to do it slowly, because he did not know what was inside. It turned out that it was a ring he had seen before. The Lord said that he had heard that the young man had felt the mana in Margaret's ring. It had been in their family for a long time, but he had no idea of its power. Then the man asked if it had helped him. The blonde answered that the ring added mana to its wearer, so he had to use it in the battle with the goblins. The Lord said with a serious expression that he was glad to hear that. He added that from now on this ring belonged to him, and the young man could consider it a badge of honor. And then the boy opened his eyes and mouth wide and asked, "The insignia?" He didn't fully understand what it meant and how it was supposed to help him. So the Lord added that from that day on, he proclaimed Ian Page a wizard and an eternal and permanent guest of the Mogrians. During these words, the blond man carefully examined the ring in his hands. Then the man asked if the young man would accept his gift. The Lord lowered his head and looked down and waited for a few seconds for a response from his guest. He didn't want to interrupt the young man's thoughts, which were now raging in his head. However, without waiting for any response, he said that their family would always welcome him with honor and come to his aid in times of need. The young man raised his head high and listened attentively. His oath will be passed down from generation to generation as long as there are Mogrians north of the Emerald River. After these words, the man and his son bowed low to the blond man. The next day, the sorcerer and several guards set off on a short journey, during which they had to walk part of the forest. One of them was constantly walking next to the blond man. Suddenly, the young man stopped and turned to the captain and asked how far it was to Lloyd's village. The guard was not expecting such a question, so he thought about his answer for a few seconds. Then he smiled sweetly and said that there was not much left. They only had to go around a small mountain and then they would be there, so they had to hurry up. At that moment, the sorcerer had a memory of asking the Lord if there were any alchemists in the province who could make the elixir. The man replied that he knew that an alchemist named Letio lived in the village of Lloyd in the north. He's from the capital, but he's come to collect special herbs. So you can visit him and ask him if he can do you a favor, namely, develop an elixir that can help restore the missing mana. These reflections were interrupted by one of the guards, who shouted loudly and pointed forward, asking the sorcerer to look there, because something strange was happening there. And when they got a little closer, they saw that a large fire was going on in the village at the foot of the mountain. The smoke was quickly spreading around. The blond man froze in place for a few seconds, surprised. He hadn't expected to see something like that. He was hoping that at least today everything would go smoothly and without incident. However, the guards were not at a loss and had already begun to take out their weapons, but they had to get an order from the sorcerer to use it because they could not act on their own. At this time, a group of robbers was causing chaos in the settlement and frightening the locals. The leader of the bandits put an axe on his right shoulder and smilingly ordered his subordinates to deal with the rest of them because it was time to go on their way. Then the man smiled slyly and added that it was time to take the man they had come for to Lockwood. Another distinctive feature that distinguished this impudent man was that he had a black patch over his right eye. It turns out that the person they came for was a young man who was screaming loudly and resisting because he was being kidnapped. The frightened father shouted after his son, calling his name, namely Douglas. The man was upset that he could not do anything at the moment. However, the main thief managed to deliver a crushing blow to this gentleman. When he fell to the ground, he put his foot on him. Looking at his victim, the insolent man put his hand to the side and said to him that he had spoken too much. This is how he deserved this punishment. The boy tried his best to get out of the kidnapper's hands and run to his father's aid, but he was mostly annoyed. So he turned to face the young man and asked him if he needed to kill his father to finally shut his mouth. Immediately after saying these words, he raised the knife up and told his father that he would take his son to a better place and he could rest in peace. The young man began to cry loudly because he did not want his father to die like that. He deserved a better life than they had. However, everything did not happen as expected. For some reason, it was the attacker who was pierced by some rather strange weapon. The rest of the hooligans began to fuss among themselves, saying, "What happened? Where did this ice come from? And what was that all about?" And when they finally saw the blonde sorcerer approaching them, they decided that they needed to run in different directions. And the young man returned to his rock from where he could normally observe everything that was happening in the small settlement. Then he turned his attention to his right hand and realized that the ring really helped, so he could use it more often. And it was with her help that he rose to the 3rd grade level. At that time, the family approached the deceased, who was lying on the ground. However, this perfect silence around the guy was broken by his main assistant, who called him by name to get his attention. Then the blonde asked the captain if there were any wounded. The captain replied that thanks to him, they were all safe, so there was no reason to worry. The young man turned his gaze slightly to the right and down and said briefly and clearly, "Good." And he froze, looking at something carefully. Then the question arose in his mind whether the man they tried to kill was still alive. Everyone was trying to bring him to life at the same time. Even his son was sitting next to him and asked his father to wake up. However, for several minutes, the man showed no signs of life. So the blond man quietly came closer, put his hand on the young man's shoulder, and asked for permission to examine his father. After receiving a positive answer, the sorcerer began to examine everything carefully, because every small element can be important. He also noticed that the gentleman had very light skin, as if there was no blood underneath. He also had gray strands in his hair. After a few minutes of careful examination, the sorcerer realized that there are some people who have mana only in their brains. This made the man look even worse. Because of this, the blond man acted immediately and put 2 fingers of his left hand on the victim's scrap, and a blue light appeared around them. The only way to relieve the pain is to remove the remnants of stagnant mana and introduce new mana. After that, all the wounds began to gradually disappear. Then the sorcerer got to his feet and began to walk slowly toward the exit, and a young man grabbed him by the back of his clothes and asked if his father would survive. With a sad expression on his face, the young man said that this improvement would only last for a certain period of time. After all, this action does not cure the disease completely. My son became very upset because this is how things turned out, because he had a little hope for good news. And at this time, the thought occurred to the sorcerer that the effect would not last long. So the man would have to choose an option, either to receive mana constantly or to die. The son was very upset by this development, because he loves his father. However, the boy suddenly began to run quickly to the right, and his father's friend loudly asked where Douglas was going. When the blond man heard the name, he repeated it to himself, because it seemed familiar enough. It was as if he had already known a person with that name in the past. And a second later, I remembered that this name belonged to a very great and respected alchemist in history, who was a native of ordinary people. In his past life, the objects of his hatred were sorcerers. He is an alchemist who became addicted to mana because of a sorcerer and a magic flower that grows in the south. This flower is indeed endowed with the effect of neutralizing mana, but it is also a strong poison. Therefore, it must be used correctly. Because of this, the blonde used acceleration magic to catch up with the young man and talk to him seriously. Perhaps he would listen to him. When the sorcerer appeared in front of the young man, he was quite frightened because he did not expect anyone to follow him. The blonde man put both hands on his shoulders and said that there might still be bandits outside the village, so it was not safe at the moment. The dark-haired man began to cry again, saying that he could not just leave his father to die because he could find the flower. Then the sorcerer used the magic of putting him to sleep because he simply could not bear to watch his son suffer while looking at his father. However, the son still hoped to find a flower that would help his father continue to live his carefree life. But he was already so tired from the excitement that he simply did not have the strength to go in search, so he fell into the arms of his interlocutor. He began to cry loudly because he was unprepared for such a loss at such an early age. He still dreamed of spending a lot of time with his father. While the young man was resting quietly on the grass, the sorcerer looked at him and emphasized that despite his age, he still looked like Douglas from his past life. And then the boy realized that if he did not come to the village, Douglas's father would die, and he would be captured. The sorcerer realizes that it was Douglas who created the poison that killed him, and he knew Ragnar's plan. Because of this, he wonders if he needs to get rid of this problem now. But he realized that hasty decisions could backfire on him, so for the time being, he would not use force against him. After all, he is so talented that he has risen from the bottom to the status of an imperial alchemist. That's why you need to lure him to your side. However, the question arose, where are the guarantees that he will not give it away? We could protect him from slavery. And then, these thoughts were interrupted by a man's voice. It turns out that it was the blonde's chief assistant who rushed after him as soon as he started running, and he finally managed to find him. Then the man turned his head to the young man, who was lying quietly on the grass, resting. The assistant asked what had happened to him. The sorcerer replied that the young man was acting recklessly, so he had to put him to sleep for a while because he might do something stupid. And the blonde man said, bending low, that since the guard had come, he would be tasked with taking this young man to the village because it was dangerous to stay here. For some reason, he started moving in a completely different direction. The assistant asked if he would not go with them. After all, he had come here for him. The sorcerer turned his slanting gaze to his companion and said with a serious expression that he had to go to a certain place so they could go without him. After everything happened, everyone returned home late in the evening. We started to rest because the day had been hard, both mentally and physically. A man approached the boy, who was lying quietly on the bed, resting, and asked him in a calm tone if he was sleeping. It turns out that it was my father. He managed to recover, and he said that he was told that a sorcerer had appeared in the village and saved them. A minute later, he added that he also knew that they were up to something reckless. The young man continued to lie in the same position and said that the gentleman had promised that he would find the flower. When his father heard this, he was surprised and said that it was very dangerous because the robbers could still be around and harm him. Finally, the boy got up and shouted in hysterics what he needed to do because he was told that his dad would continue to be ill. The man was very upset by his son's reaction, but he realized that the boy did not want to lose his care so soon. This symbolizes that he loves him very much. Sobbing, the man said that he had been looking for this flower for over a year and had no luck. Therefore, this gentleman will not be able to find it either, so there is nothing to hope for. However, someone knocked quietly on their door so as not to scare them or wake them up, because it was already very late for the guests. My father asked in a confident tone who was there. A blond man dressed in a cloak stood outside the door and replied that he had been told they needed the Randor flower. Hearing this, the man walked slowly to the door and carefully opened the wooden door to welcome such a late guest. As soon as the light fell on the sorcerer's face, he carefully began to remove his hood so that everyone present could see who had come. At the same time, he wished everyone a good evening. The boy told his father that it was the same sorcerer they had been talking about. The blond man put the object on the table and said that his name was Ian Page. The building owner's attention was drawn to an object that appeared on his desk, so he immediately asked what it was. At the same time, my son suggested that this might be the flower he had been looking for so long and could not find. He stood still for a few minutes to see at least something from a distance. The sorcerer looked at the table and said that he would give this flower to them, but in return, they had to answer him a question. Then he turned his attention to the owners of the house and asked how they knew about the effect of this flower. The man did not immediately answer. At first, he said, "Well?" And then he was silent for a few seconds, as if searching for words. But on the second attempt, he also did not give a complete answer, only adding, "I read about her." And again he fell silent, as if afraid to tell the truth. Nevertheless, he gathered his strength and said that he had read about it in a reference book. After saying that, he immediately raised his head and looked at his interlocutor. Then he brought a book and said that his father had given it to him. And having opened the right page, he asked the blonde to look at what was written there. It said that this flower grows only in the south and can neutralize mana. It has 12 dark-colored petals. The green stems and leaves are poisonous. It wilts as soon as it is picked. After reading this, the blonde man asked if his father was also an alchemist. The man answered this question quickly, saying that alchemy was their family business. Then my dad folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the nearby wall, waiting to see what the guest would say next. And the blonde man looked up at his interlocutor and said that then the gentleman should know that for a sorcerer with 2 mana, he added that the poison of this flower is fatal. The father listened carefully to this statement. He said that he understood what the boy was talking about. He said that their family had never made elixirs that could harm living beings. And to prove it, he said he could put his hand on his heart. The son did not fully understand what these 2 adults were talking about. The sorcerer gave a short and clear "I see" to this information, and then he turned his gaze slowly to the right. Then he thanked me for the answer and took the flower in his hands and raised it high up. A small blue smoke began to appear around it. There was already a lot of blue smoke in the room, and the sorcerer turned his back on the owners and asked them for forgiveness. And when the ice broke, the gentleman had a wilted flower on his hand. And looking at it, he said that it was impossible to transport. He just wanted to preserve its shape by freezing it. The father was surprised by what he saw and asked how the man could have lied to them. The guest replied that he had proved to them that he could find the flower. Then I stretched out my hand to the owner and said that I was offering him a bet, which will be profitable for both him and them. And he began to tell him that he would give him mana so that he would stop depending on his illness. He would also find a way to use the flower in medicine. Instead, the man had to go to the capital with the sorcerer. Finally, the guest added that the gentleman should make elixirs that would help him gather the mana he needs to treat his mother. The man did not like this proposal very much, so he said that as far as he knew, the sorcerer could hire any alchemist. And he's not the best candidate. The blonde man said he needed an alchemist who would travel with him and make elixirs specifically for him. Then the sorcerer turned his gaze to the young man and said that his son ran to the forest without thinking about anything but his salvation. Therefore, he emphasized that he was confident that the gentleman would be able to make the right decision for the good of his child. The homeowner asked if he could give the gentleman time to think about it. The blonde man said, "Of course." And so it turns out that in this life, Douglas did not lose his father, and I did not become a slave. Therefore, he would not allow his talent to fall into Ragnar's hands. The father approached his son and put his hand on his head, and he began to smile with satisfaction. A few hours later, it was morning, and the blonde man stood there silently looking at the village where he would spend the night. However, his idyll was interrupted by the voice of an assistant who came up behind him and called out to his master, so he turned around. The guards said that they had already completed all the preparations, and as soon as the sorcerer was ready, they could set off. Hearing these words, the gentleman was a little upset because he had not yet received any response to his agreement, so he froze for a few seconds. He turned his attention to the house of the father and son he had saved yesterday. However, no one came out of that door. Then the blonde man lowered his head and gazed down a bit and said that the workers could start moving out a little bit. At the same time, the thought flashed through my mind that they hadn't dared. However, wooden doors slowly began to open in the building, and a father and son appeared through them. They seemed to be packing for a trip. The sorcerer froze in place, looking at them carefully, because he simply did not expect them to come out and give any answer at all. So he started walking toward them, asking if they had made a decision. The man replied that there was no point in refusing because his life depended on the sorcerer. His son, on the other hand, was very happy that they would finally have a normal life, without constant fear for his father and his health. Approaching the blonde man with a sweet smile on his face, He emphasized that he had to keep his promise. Ian began to smile sincerely and answered that he would definitely fulfill everything he had promised earlier. The son went to his father and again asked the sorcerer a clarifying question. Could he really cure his father? The young man turned his gaze to the boy and began to smile sweetly at him. He thought about the answer for a few seconds. Then silence fell between them. And then he said in a calm tone that he promised to do so. He wouldn't have said that if he wasn't going to help. These words made the boy's smile burst into a smile, so he asked with a wide-open mouth if he could call the blonde captain. The sorcerer was a little surprised by this question, but said that if he wanted to, he could, of course. He liked it even better that way. At this time, the sorcerer remembered an adult alchemist from his past life who was rude and once even told him to wash the blonde out of his eyes as soon as possible. Suddenly, this conversation was interrupted by the loud sound of hooves approaching them. The rider ordered the horse to slow down and stop. It was one of the sorcerer's assistants who told them that they had to hurry because they had to get home before dark. The blonde man asked if something had happened. Why did they have to rush? The guard replied that the prince had crossed the Kamas River. Upon hearing this information, the sorcerer was surprised that he was already so close to them, so they really needed to get on the road quickly. The assistant said that they had been informed about it in the morning. The sorcerer wondered why he was the last to know. But he did not analyze the situation, and instead asked his subordinate if he would lend him his horse. The subordinate, in turn, asked if the gentleman knew how to ride it. As the blonde man approached the animal, he began to stroke its muzzle and said that he didn't quite understand it, but he thought they could get along. That's why I use the magic of taming, because you can't hope for a good case. You have to always be on the safe side, because there may not be another chance. Approaching the horse's ear, he told it in a calm tone that he needed to go to the castle of the province. And as he did so, his pupils glowed blue. The animal began to slowly sink down to the ground so that the man could climb up into the saddle to set off on his journey. When he finally took his seat, he turned to Captain Arnold and told him to remember to pick up Mr. Ledio. After all, he will be the first to leave, and therefore it is the main assistant who will be responsible for the safety and lives of these two people. At this time, the carriage in which the prince was traveling was slowly moving through the forest. The man was sitting in a closed carriage, and guards were riding around him on horseback. The prince was very sad and bored on such a long journey, so he was constantly trying to look out the window to entertain himself a little bit. And the memory of how his father once called him to his room and told him that he had a few more errands to run. He told him that the owner of the tower had recently been in very active communication with the fifth prince. The boy listened attentively to everything his father said, and since many aristocrats listened to him, it is very important that Havert takes the prince's side. The son did not yet understand where his father was going and what was required of him. It turns out that the fifth prince, Ragnar, is quite intelligent, so the man is simply sure that he will use Havert to get himself good allies. Then the father turned his head to his son and added that Ian Page should take his side. After all, he and his power would be very useful to their kingdom. Before the tower can accept anything, the young man has to win it over to his side, and it will be useful to him in any situation. The prince did not like this idea very much, which made him even more upset again, because he did not want to follow his father's orders, but to manage his own life. After all, Ian is a sorcerer, but he looks like a child, so the young man did not understand what sense he would make. And in general, all wizards are subordinate to the ivory tower, so he would not go over to the prince's side. However, another question arose. Why did the owner of the tower choose Ragnar? The young man then said to himself, with his hand over his face, that when he became emperor, he would remove all those who ignored him. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the street, who addressed His Majesty to tell him something. It was the second captain of the Imperial Knights, named Oliver Raywood, who refused, saying that, in his opinion, at least now it was necessary to send a message to Mogrian Castle. However, the blond man propped his head up with his right hand and replied in a serious tone that they had already discussed this, and his decision had not changed since then. The captain continued to insist on his point, because people there needed to prepare for his arrival in order to meet him with dignity and receive him. However, the gentleman did not want to hear any of this, so he asked if the captain's family lived north of Morin. The subordinate answered briefly and clearly, "Yes." "That's right." Then the chief asked a question that clarified how much longer they had to travel, and the assistant answered that it would be about 2 days. Upon hearing this information, the gentleman smiled sweetly and said that since there was not much time left, the captain could send a message. Then he folded his arms across his chest and added that he would see how the Guardians of the North and the Shields of the Empire would meet such a distinguished person. The subordinate, who was standing by the door at the time and heard everything clearly, was quite surprised that the prince could so easily change his mind and plans. The next day, everyone in the castle was in a frenzy because the prince's heiress would soon arrive, and His Majesty was always giving orders and being the last one to make sure that not a single speck of dust was visible. The man had been so tired over the past day that he had a headache and sat down to think about why they hadn't informed him about the visit earlier, because he hadn't expected such a quick visit. However, he found the strength to go out into the corridor and noticed a butler there and asked him if the other families had arrived yet. The mustachioed gentleman replied that the McFadden and Raywoods would be here soon, and the rest of us were already here. His Majesty then asked if the sorcerer had returned and if there was any information about him at all. The butler shook his head and replied that, unfortunately, he could not hear anything. The boss was embarrassed by this answer, but it was time to go to the guests. And as soon as they got to the courtyard, one of the guards loudly called out to His Majesty and said that the prince had already arrived and was ready to meet him to greet him. And a snow-white carriage was already passing along the small path with a rather important guest who needed to be properly met. When the carriage and crew finally stopped, the door slowly opened, and a blond young man, who felt quite confident, got out of the carriage. At this moment, His Majesty and his assistant were wondering where the sorcerer was. After all, they hoped he would arrive soon. This situation makes everyone a little upset, because they really need his presence here. After all, the prince did not just come to visit. Suddenly, however, the sound of hooves was heard from the right side, and His Majesty turned his head to see the one they had been waiting for. The blonde was very tired because he had not expected the journey to be so difficult, so he apologized for being late. When the sorcerer got down to the ground, the chief said that they were very happy to see him here. Since the emperor's order was addressed to him personally, the boy should stand in front of everyone. Having taken the right position, the blonde approached the two men who were already waiting to be met by someone. Then the prince looked down a little and clenched both hands into a fist and asked if it was Ian Page, because he was the reason they had come here. At that moment, the blonde man looked at the other man and emphasized to himself that he had not seen him so close for a very long time. Then the young man turned his gaze back and saw a group of people dressed in long gray cloaks discussing something with each other. This piercing look was noticed by one of the girls who had short black hair, so she turned her head to see who was looking at her. It turns out that it was a young lady named Cecilia, who had quite nice features and green, big eyes. And she is also a spy for the Coldwood Empire. When their eyes met, the blonde man broke into a satisfied smile. A few minutes later, everyone moved to the castle to hold the meeting. The prince's aide closed his eyes and addressed him, but he reminded him to know his limits, because he had already drunk enough wine. The host told him that the only food here was drinks. Turning his gaze to the right, he said why he had come so far, for he did not even like the sorcerer. The assistant listened attentively in silence. This was his job, to accompany the prince everywhere and be his company. But sometimes he was so bored with everything that he wanted to go on a vacation as soon as possible. At this time, Cecilia leaned against the wall and sipped red wine. And then the thought flashed through her mind that the emperor's tasks were becoming increasingly strange. That's why she doesn't know why they are interested in the boy. A few days ago, she received 2 orders. The first was to check if the rumors about Ian were true, and if so, to kidnap him and his mother and bring him to Colwood. But she still doesn't know what's so special about him that he needs to be kidnapped. For some reason, however, she did not notice him in the hall. It was already very dark outside, and a large fire was lit in the middle of the backyard. It turns out that the blonde was at the training ground. Because he was not interested in what was happening inside, he had completely different interests. The black-haired young lady first decided to check what this young man is capable of before drawing any conclusions, so she will start right now. And with the easiest spell, the magic arrow. Because you need to find out everything gradually, so as not to harm or give away your intentions. However, it didn't work out, because the young man was able to use the magic of the shield in time to protect himself. And it turns out that he passed the first test successfully. The sorcerer turned his gaze to the lady, and with a serious expression and a rude tone, asked who she was and what she wanted from him. The black-haired woman smiled and replied that she was also a sorceress from the ivory tower. She added that she had come to say hello. The young man asked whether it was customary for them to greet others by attacking them from behind. After all, it's not fair to do that to another person. The young lady was surprised to hear such words, so she asked the boy to watch his tongue, because she was older and he should show respect. However, the young man interrupted this speech by saying the young lady's name, Cecilia, which surprised the interlocutor because she thought he did not know her. The sorcerer continued, Cecilia Coldwater. The young lady froze in place with her mouth and eyes wide open, for she did not understand where he had gotten this information. So she asked who he was, and how did he know her name? The blonde man did not hesitate to ask a counter-question about how she guessed. At this time, the thought flashed through his mind that he wouldn't know, because that's the name given to all spies of the Coldwood Empire. And he said out loud that he could name everyone who worked with her. He immediately began to say, Yol, the observer of Molten's stable, Robin, secretary to Emperor Aereo, soldier of the 9th Detachment. The woman did not understand what was happening now, and the sorcerer continued to speak, and his next clarification was that he could name what they all had in common, because he even knew that. The black-haired girl tried not to show that she was very confused and nervous, because this boy had told her a lot of personal information. So she said in a calm tone that she didn't know how he knew so much, but he would be better off pretending that he didn't know anything. In her hand, she used the magic of fire, and a bright orange light began to appear around her, which was spreading every minute. But the sorcerer quickly put it out. Again, this surprised the young lady because it had never happened before in her experience. Holding a small yellow ball, glowing with white light in his palm, the young man said that he was the only one who knew about them. The black-haired girl began to smile, asking why he hadn't told someone else. And the thought flashed through her mind that he was not injured at all, and how could that be possible after she had used fire magic? The blond man raised his right hand and added with a broad smile that he knew why they were looking for him and what they had to do. The sorceress froze in her tracks, for she had been closely watching all the actions of the interlocutor, for it was clear from his actions that he was up to something. And it was not in vain, because the sorcerer was able to use the magic of freezing with just one hand and send a small group of sharp arrows made of ice at the young lady. Then the sorcerer moved his hand a little forward, as if he were controlling his newly created weapon to demonstrate his strength and power. And the ice arrows really began to fly in the direction the blond man's hand was pointing. However, he had to use a lot of mana to do this. When the opponent saw this, she was confused for a second, because she had never had to fight such young men using her most effective weapon. So she began to use a mana barrier to protect herself from this weapon. She held it with both hands because the airflow was very strong. However, even the shield began to crack under the strain, but the sorceress did not lose hope that he would be able to save her. And the blonde decided to use fire magic to melt his opponent's shield and get her out of the protection to continue the battle. When everything was ready, the guy launched a fire blast right at the place where the witch was standing, and everything around her glowed orange. And then the lady realized that she could not attack while she was holding the barrier. However, if she didn't move away now, she would simply die. And in just 1 second, the shield cracked and broke into many small particles that had been floating in the air for several seconds. And then they began to injure the sorceress, who stood in her place and tried to endure the pain that these particles were causing her. However, when the explosion occurred, the sorceress managed to dodge and was caught by an explosive wave of air that spread quite quickly. A few seconds later, the black-haired woman turned her head back to see what had happened. This gave her a chance to catch her breath and rest a bit. Then she fell to the ground and put her right hand on her stomach and grimaced at the pain that tore through her body. However, she was surprised that she was able to survive. But while I was lying there, I began to think that he must have used up all the mana to use the fireball, and soon people will come here. However, he has no dirt on her, and no one will believe the child's words. Because of this, she decided to recuperate first, and then solve problems as they came. However, she was approached by a blond man who said he could open her up, and all this right now. After saying these words, the guy began to smile slyly, as if he really had something for her. The black-haired woman began to smile to herself, wondering if it was true. After all, in her opinion, it was simply not possible. However, the young man added that there was evidence that the Cold Walkers themselves were not aware of. The black-haired woman became serious, and all she could say was, "That's nonsense." And at that moment, many people came running to the training field, hearing the powerful explosion and running to the echo of the sound and dust that was still in the air. The prince's aide wanted to ask what was going on here, but he didn't have time because the black-haired fellow saw her and said her name and began to walk quickly toward her. He sat down next to her and began to help her up, asking what happened. There were many small wounds on her body. The young lady did not have time to answer because the blonde man did it for her, saying that it was he who had done all this to her. All those present turned their heads to him, and the prince's assistant, with a serious expression and a rude tone, asked for an explanation because everyone present did not fully understand everything. So the guy has to explain why he did it. The sorcerer began to tell him that he had accidentally noticed the lady. She was talking to a man wearing a mask. The words she heard surprised the black-haired woman, and she said, "What?" with her mouth wide open. However, this did not prevent him from continuing his story, so he added that when they saw him, they tried to kill him. After listening carefully, the guard decided to clarify that the blonde man was only defending himself. The young man answered briefly and clearly, "Yes." Then the prince's assistant asked if he could prove his words. The sorcerer replied that they had checked each other's bodies, and these could be marks, so he had to examine them. The black-haired woman's comrades came to her defense and asked if the captain was crossing the border. Does he really distrust the wizards from the tower? But the man did not answer any of the questions, and instead slowly drew his sharp, large sword. And then he raised it to the faces of the two men, demonstrating that he was not going to listen to them at all. Therefore, he decided to make it clear that a follower of the king was here, and that an unpleasant incident had occurred in this place. Because of this, he needs to find out what really happened, and how it is connected to the wizards of the tower. The young lady's friend asked for a few minutes to heal her, though. However, the assistant was quite determined, so he said that they would be able to do this only after the inspection was completed. This procedure was carried out by two women who came with the prince, so they were asked if they had found anything. The young ladies shook their heads and sadly reported that they had not seen anything suspicious. The sorcerers realized that they were right, so they immediately said that they had said exactly what they had said before. And it turned out that they were suspecting the wrong people, so they immediately began treatment. The assistant turned his gaze to the blonde man and asked him a question to find out if he had lied to him. The sorcerer closed his eyes and replied that he had no intention of doing so because it would be of no use to him. Immediately after he said that, he began to walk slowly toward the black-haired woman, who was still sitting on the ground covered in wounds. He went behind her back and put his hand on her neck and apologized for having to do this. The young lady began to resist a little, and turning her gaze back, she tried to see what this impudent boy, who had already done enough damage to her, was going to do. Everyone present froze in their seats because they were also curious about what the blonde was going to show them. A few seconds later, a blue mark of mana appeared where he touched it. Chornyava turned her gaze to her abuser and asked him what he was doing. What does he want from her? The guy didn't give any answer to her question, instead saying that he saw them running their hands around in that place, probably checking the tags. All cold walkers are sent to training camps where they are marked. Only the trainers know about it. Only after a year of interrogation did one of them crack and tell the secret. The prince's assistant turned his head to the other magicians and asked them if they knew what it could mean. What meaning does it have? The men replied that it was the first time they had seen it. Then the assistant asked Ian if he knew. The young man replied that he did not know either. This made the assistant think about the fact that no one knows the meaning of the mark, but it clearly means something important. So he ordered her to be treated first, and the interrogation would be arranged later. Chornyava was furious at this development, and her two friends had to prepare a mana maker. The men were also upset, because they were too sure of their rightness. Then the prince's assistant turned his head toward the blonde and addressed him by name so that he would look at him. And when their eyes met, the dark man said that if it turned out that he was right, then he would definitely tell His Majesty about it. The blonde stood silently and listened attentively, for this was important information to him. Just a few hours later, the man finally told the prince that the boy had defeated a third-grade sorcerer, and the prince was quite surprised. And at one point, it was even funny, because no one could believe it, because this had never happened in their lifetime. So the prince folded his arms across his chest and asked Oliver what his opinion of this blonde man was, because it was important for him to hear this information. The assistant said that this guy was really different from all the sorcerers he had met before. His speech and behavior are not like those of ordinary commoners. After these words, the prince thought that he would need to meet in person to verify all of the above. So he asked Oliver to bring him. When the blond man entered the room, he immediately bowed his head and looked down as a sign of respect and asked in a low voice if His Majesty had called for him. At this time, the man was already standing by the wardrobe with his hands behind his back, saying that he had been informed that the young man had managed to find a spy among the Coldwoods and had defeated her, even though she was a top-class sorceress. Finally, the gentleman added that he could say with certainty that it was a worthy victory. The blond man closed his eyes and said that he was honored by the praise. Then the prince spread his arms to the sides and began to smile sweetly, saying that the sorcerer deserved a reward, so if he has a specific wish, he can voice it. And then the thought flashed through the young man's mind that the prince wanted to test how greedy the boy was, but he would fail. However, once they offered, he would not refuse. He began to say that if they allowed him to, he would like to see the ruins of the old ivory tower on his way out of the castle. Hearing this request, the gentleman was quite surprised, so he repeated the words, "Ruins of an old tower? Why? What's interesting there?" The young man replied that he had been told about him as a child, so he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. The prince thought that the sorcerer could have asked for anything, but he asked for such a small thing. However, what can you expect from a child? So I decided to agree, because after all, it was a wish from someone who had done a very good deed for him, so it would not be a pity to spend several hours traveling for it. However, the blonde asked for this for a reason, because under the ruins of the old tower, there is a dungeon where a book with dragon spells. It is written in the dragon language, which played a key role in the study of temporal magic. This manuscript cannot be found anywhere else. In his past life, he found it shortly before his death and was never able to understand it completely. This time, however, he would have more time to learn a lot of new things. This made him happy, because the day and evening before had been quite stressful. The next day, the crew set off on a journey through a dense forest. The beautiful wooden carriage was accompanied by guards on horseback on all sides. The mother looked out the window with her mouth wide open and said that this was the first time they had ever gotten this far, and it was very beautiful. Then the woman turned her gaze to her son and asked him a clarifying question. Did he think it was also true, or maybe he thought differently? However, the blond man began to smile sincerely, saying that he also liked the fact that they would travel the world together in the future. The alchemist put his right hand over his heart and said that he would need to give Mrs. Page a tour, and he could do it because he had lived in the capital for a long time. The young lady began to laugh loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. Finally, she could relax a little bit and have a normal rest and enjoy the moment. This reaction made my son a little angry, so he turned his head to the window to calm down a little. Suddenly, however, he heard a knock at the door. It turns out that it was the second vice captain of the Imperial Army, named Paul, who knocked. And he told Ian that they had already arrived at the place. So the sorcerer, as soon as the carriage stopped, began to get out, to see everything with his own eyes. Looking around, everything was just like in his past life. Paul went on to say that they would stay here for 2 days, and His Majesty allowed Ian to move freely throughout the territory of the destroyed castle. After the words were said, the man began to smile sweetly, because he was in a pretty good mood today, and they went on a trip. However, first he decided to show everyone who came to the camp the place where they would stay, i.e., where they would be able to rest. The people listened attentively, and he began to follow the vice captain. A few minutes later, they arrived in a small village, where they were greeted by a group of people who said with a sincere smile that it was a great honor to receive a follower. The prince was a little confused by these words, so he began to smile unnaturally, saying that he did not need to attach such importance to it. The sorcerer silently watched this situation from the sidelines, for he was curious about the kind of person this prince was and whether he had any weaknesses at all. And then the boy concluded that the gentleman was not behaving badly with ordinary people, so maybe he was actually a good person and not the one he wanted to appear to be. And a memory from my past life came to mind. Namely, when they met, the prince looked quite hostile and was always angry with everyone around him. There was no smile on his face, and his eyebrows were drawn together. His eyes reflected orange light. Therefore, we could conclude that he was dissatisfied with his life. However, He may still have behaved like that because Ragnar was always with the sorcerer, and not all the locals liked his behavior and confidence. He behaves differently with other people who do not belong to the family and aristocrats. He smiles sweetly, happily, and naturally carries on a conversation. He must have realized that the emperor wanted his son to become a follower. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by the alchemist's son, who addressed the blonde as captain and asked when they would go to the ruins. The sorcerer asked in surprise what the young man wanted there. The boy ran his hand through his hair and said that he would like to see it too. The blonde was tired, so he closed his eyes and began to think that the basement would still appear at dawn, so he told the young man that they would go down together tomorrow. The boy was very happy to hear these words. He couldn't believe it, so he asked again, "Shall we go together?" Because he was clearly not expecting such an offer. Immediately after the positive answer, the young man's emotions exploded, and he began to rejoice loudly, smiling and thanking for the opportunity. Watching this conversation from the side, the alchemist said to the sorcerer's mother that Douglas must have made friends with Ian. Finally, his boy would have someone useful to spend time with. Then he turned his gaze to the beautiful young lady, and, with his hands over his mouth, turned to Mrs. Page to say that he wanted to ask her a question. I immediately wondered if Ian had always acted like such an adult, since he was only 12 years old. At his age, other children think about completely different things. The blonde woman turned her gaze to her son and said, looking at him sweetly, that Ian had grown up very early because he had no other option. He is very intelligent and caring, just like his father. Although he doesn't say anything, the woman feels guilty that he has to try to replace his father. The interlocutor clarified, "Does he look like his father? Was your husband a sorcerer?" The gentleman was interested in learning more about the people he was traveling with. The mother tilted her head and looked down a little, as painful memories came to mind, and answered that no. Her Fran was an ordinary person, just like she was. After all, even before Ian was born, the man went to work and disappeared. When 5 years passed, they got his things back. And she doesn't know why, but lately Ian has been... However, she didn't finish her sentence, because she realized that she might say too much, and then her son would be angry. So if he wants to tell me, he will. And she answered briefly, no. And the interlocutor did not ask, because his conscience did not allow him to press on what the person did not want to talk about. It was a journey by wind and stars. After the war ended, he was able to escape the supervision of the emperor and the ivory tower and wandered around without meaning. And was it a mere coincidence that he came across the ruins of the old tower on his way? But it wasn't just that. He had to come here. And today, a young sorcerer stood on this spot. He stopped on the first step and looked carefully at everything around him because he had seen this place before. A few seconds later, he realized that nothing had changed at all since then. Therefore, what he came here for must be in its place. 300 years ago, a war took place here between the wizards of the tower and the followers of the dragons, the Draconians. But some of the walls still managed to survive and withstand this battle. Dragons and gargoyles used black magic and had enough power to destroy an entire empire because they needed to eliminate their rivals. However, the high-ranking wizards of the tower had Mitchell Greenriver as the past ruler of the empire because he could not leave his comrades to their fate, and they were able to subdue the will of the dragons and destroy the gargoyles to keep peace on their land. When the emperor led his empire to victory, he gave up his status and devoted himself entirely to his work in the tower. After a while, the old tower stopped being used because people lost interest in it. Therefore, the area became a ruin, which the boy was now looking at. Then he began to walk slowly to the place where he was supposed to be, and, in his opinion, it had to be here. So he stood still for a few seconds. Then he touched one of the stones and began to observe what would happen after that, because it takes some time. It turned out that a staircase was supposed to appear, leading deep into the dungeon, into which he immediately began to descend without anyone noticing him. It was quite dark there, so the blond man had to use the magic of light. After that, a small ball of blue light appeared in his hand. When the room finally became lighter, he saw a large statuette in front of him that looked like a gargoyle. It was quite creepy and inspired some fear, and the thought flashed through his mind that when he first saw this creature, he was very surprised because it looked completely different from what he had imagined. After all, this creature had a large mouth with many different sized teeth that could deliver a deadly bite. Who knew that a real gargoyle would be found in a godforsaken place 300 years after those events, and that it could attack him now? And everything happened as expected. The creature pushed off the shelf it was sitting on and began to fly straight at the sorcerer, who froze in place for a few seconds. But having mastered his feelings, the guy decided to quickly use a water balloon to stop the creature and prevent it from attacking him. The water balloon hit the gargoyle right in the stomach and threw it back. The creature did not expect to be stopped like that. Therefore, it began to scream loudly out of surprise. Then he hit one of the walls, and a large dent immediately formed in that place, and a cloud of dust rose. The blonde began to look at that place to see what was wrong with the creature. After all, in his past life, he got rid of it in 1 second. But with his current powers, he needs to work hard. That's why you need to think carefully about your steps. And while he was thinking about it, the gargoyle had already climbed out and began to look intently at his offender, who was now standing below and also looking at him. However, the creature was so angry about what the boy had done to it that it began to move quickly toward its offender. But the young man also had magic he could use in such a case, namely ice spears, which in a couple of seconds began to fly with the sharp side towards the creature. One of them even managed to pierce the creature in the stomach, which again allowed it to stop the offender in midair for a few seconds. However, the blonde decided not to wait that long and immediately used the magic of lightning, which began to appear immediately around his hand. A second later, he pointed this weapon in the direction of the gargoyle, and it began to burn, and a large fire of bright orange color appeared around it. Then the young man began to think about what he could do after defeating this giant, dangerous creature, which, in his opinion, was no longer showing any signs of life. A passage should immediately appear. So the young man began to look around carefully, so as not to miss what he had just fought for. And in a second, 2 doors to an even deeper dungeon appeared in the stone ground on the boy's right side, into which the sorcerer must go next. When the young man saw this, he realized that everything was exactly the same as in his previous life, so it gave him great pleasure. To get down, the young man used the magic of an easy landing, because there were no stairs down, so he had to get out of the situation. In this room, there was a large concrete table with a book on it, on which light fell through the ceiling and illuminated everything around. The young man was very pleased to see her, because in this life they were able to meet much earlier, and he would be able to apply her knowledge. The book looked very beautiful. Some of its parts were decorated with gold, which gave it great value in those difficult times for all people. When Ian came closer to the table, he calmly and quietly addressed his find and asked who had hidden it here, in this god-forsaken place. Then the boy began to suggest who could have done it. And, in his opinion, it could have been the dragon or the first sorcerer, because no one else could have done it. So he hopes that at least in this lifetime, he will be able to analyze more recordings and thus understand her better. After all, they will have enough time. But when he carefully picked it up and opened the pages, what he saw surprised him. Inside were blank pages. And then he assumed that it was because he had been able to use it before. That is, he had used her knowledge in a previous life. Not fully understanding why he could not see the text in the book, the sorcerer closed it very loudly and began to think about what to do next. When he started to move toward the exit, he realized that it was good that he remembered the ones he had learned in his past life. He began to recite them in order to use at least one of them, and he was unable to use anything. The language of dragons depends entirely on mana, not on pronunciation. And it turns out that dragon spells can be used only once, and then they disappear. And then the guy realized that since he would no longer be able to use the time machine, he would not be able to go back in time. And he expected to be able to go back and forth as much as he wanted. And this conclusion upset the sorcerer a bit because he had other plans. However, it is good that he learned about it now, and not when it would have been too late. But at this time, the passage of time will put much more pressure on him. The next day, everyone set out on the road and had to arrive in the capital after a certain period of time. Ian was informed about this by one of the guards. Immediately after these words, the carriage with the guards began to drive to the gates of the settlement, where large flags, hanging at the very entrance, symbolized the authorities in the area. When the sorcerer began to look at everything through the window, the thought flashed through his mind that he was finally tired of the journey. But from that moment on, he began to worry about how the meeting would go, how he would be received here, and what conditions he would have to live and work in. He was also worried that if Cecilia escaped and united with other Cold Walkers, the Empire would immediately start hunting for him, and she will be the first to tell him that he knows about their existence. Therefore, she needs to be closely monitored at all times so that she cannot do anything like that. And this was starting to annoy him because he had enough problems without her, and now he would have to constantly deal with this young lady. But then something happened that made him stop his thoughts and look to the right in surprise at the scene of the incident that had attracted the attention of everyone present. Therefore, they all stopped in their tracks, not understanding what they should do next and why it was happening this way, because it should have been different. It turns out that a group of people dressed in long, dark cloaks appeared on the road. One of them stuck his hand out and ordered those who were moving to stop. The prince's black-haired assistant did not understand what was going on and what this gentleman wanted from them. After all, he was accompanying the main person, and an ordinary person cannot allow this to happen. However, when the man looked closely, he saw that their movement was obstructed by the owner of the tower. He stood quite confidently and was very serious. So the assistant quickly dismounted from his horse and asked the man why he was obstructing the king's follower. The gentleman replied that he had received such an order from His Majesty. The guard was quite surprised to hear this information, as he did not understand why such a decision had been made. The owner of the tower said that the investigation into the case of the sorceress Cecilia was being transferred to the ivory tower, so right now it should be given to them. The black-haired young man emphasized that he could see that the Lord was in a hurry since he did not even allow them to enter the castle, and something must have changed during their absence. The sorcerer closed his eyes and clarified that he needed to deal with everything first and not put it in a box that would be forgotten and not dealt with properly. When the assistant passed by the gentleman, he quietly told him to relax because they were taking the investigation seriously so he could be calm. And immediately after these words, the young man turned to his colleagues and told them to hand the criminal over to the owner of the tower. But then they said that it was too early to call her that. It turns out that it was the owner who said this, emphasizing that as long as the guilt is unproven, she is still the witch of the tower. Because of this, she should be treated with a certain amount of respect. This made the black-haired man very angry, and in order not to do something he would later regret, he simply clenched his hands tightly into fists. The other guards also complained that they had brought her and guarded her all this time and that the wizards would investigate. So one of them turned to the captain and asked if this was legal, and whatever the order was, it was not fair. The blonde expected this development because they are not at all concerned about Cecilia's fate. They simply cannot bear the thought of a sorcerer being judged by ordinary people. They will lock her up in the deepest prison of the ivory tower, from which even she will not be able to escape. And then they will look for a way out of this situation to save their honor. The mother looked out the window and asked her son what was wrong. He replied that it was nothing important, so you don't have to worry about anything. Then he turned to face his window and folded his arms across his chest, saying that at least that was one less problem. And he doesn't have to think about what to do with this witch. A few minutes later, however, Ian was told that His Majesty had said that before the young man could enter the castle, he needed to visit a place. When the boy came out near that place, he said with a wide open mouth, "This is..." But then the words were only in his head. That this is the estate that Ragnar gave him in his past life when he became a 5th-grade sorcerer. The prince, who was nearby, asked if the young man liked it. And then, without waiting for an answer, he said that his father wanted to give this estate to the blonde. After hearing these words, the boy bowed low and said that his mercy knew no bounds. The prince told him not to make him laugh, because what kind of mercy is that? While the young man was bowing, he remembered that, in his previous life, he was 26 years old when he received the castle as a gift, and this time he was not even 14. And he said out loud that the estate was simply magnificent. The prince put his right hand to his beard and closed his eyes, saying that the sorcerer could leave his family and assistants here while they went to the castle together. The boy asked if it was necessary to meet with the emperor today. After all, he and his mother would like to have a quick look around. The prince said yes, but the meeting should still take place. When the woman and her son entered, the lady was amazed at the grandeur and beauty of it. Ian asked her how she felt, but without waiting for an answer, he said that this was now their new home. A memory flashed through his mind that in his past life, a woman had left this world long before he received the estate. The mother put her hand on her chest and said that an ordinary person could live here because, in her opinion, this place looked better than the imperial houses. No matter how great a magician the blonde boy became, he could not accept the fact that his mother was not around. That's why he happily said that the royal family used to use this estate. But now, everything is different. He can give her anything he wants, and they will be able to spend more time together, because he missed it so much. The young man caught up with his mother and looked her straight in the eye and asked her how she was doing. The woman paused for a few minutes, not knowing how to answer, and the boy was able to conclude that in this life, he would be able to see his mother happy. And these thoughts were interrupted by a lady who said that it was quite spacious and beautiful, but she was worried about whether she would be able to keep such a large house clean. But then something rather strange happened, which even surprised the young man himself, and he turned to his mother and said that from now on, she would not have to touch the dirty dishes or clean them, because they could afford it. And he finally left his place of residence because he had an important meeting to attend. Meanwhile, everyone in the imperial castle was also preparing for the meeting. The closer the blonde approached, the more touching it was for him, because in his past life, he had never met the present emperor. After all, when he graduated from the academy and began to change the world, the disease had already taken him. However, he was constantly well spoken of because of his wisdom and political leadership. Walking behind the guard who accompanied him, the sorcerer looked at everything around him and thought that it would be good if he could get something good from His Majesty. After all, he had heard so much about him that he was indeed a very great and wonderful person to follow. And then he wondered what the fifth prince of the empire was doing now. After all, he is most like his father, but unlike him, he does not understand such feelings as compassion and mercy. Ragnar is now his old friend and new enemy. However, he did not know what would happen when they met again. It is not clear yet. And while he was thinking about all this, he had already reached the door through which he needed to enter and meet His Majesty. The guard who stood by the door began to open it slowly, because it was very large, and secondly, it was too heavy for one person to open quickly. When the sorcerer was finally able to enter, he saw the chief sitting calmly on his throne, with his son standing next to him. The blond man got down on one knee, and with his head bowed down, quietly said that he was honored to meet His Majesty. The chief told the boy to stand up in a serious tone. He began to say that Ian Page, a native of the South, was very young and had already achieved a lot. The blond man got to his feet, looked down, and replied that it was not so. His Majesty said that he was telling it like it is. After all, in such a short period of time, he could hardly learn the etiquette of a nobleman. That's why he can be himself. The young man was very offended by the words, "Relax, you haven't had time to learn all the rules of etiquette yet." Ragnar also said these words to him during their first meeting. However, these reflections were interrupted by the boss, who said that the boy had come a very long way. Then the gentleman asked if the sorcerer liked the mansion, because he had chosen one of those used by his family. Meanwhile, the prince stood nearby and listened attentively. The guy began to smile sweetly, saying that he had never thought of such a house even in his wildest dreams. And at this point, of course, he had to lie. But His Majesty did not understand what the guest meant, so he decided to ask if he liked it or not. The guy looked up at the other man and said that he certainly liked it, and that his mother was also very happy that they would live in such a beautiful place. Then His Majesty asked if the sorcerer knew why he was here. Why did he send his follower after him? Why did he invite him to the estate? And why did he give him a house upon his arrival? While these questions were being asked, thoughts flashed through his mind. Should he answer directly? After all, straightforwardness was a quality he liked in Ragnar, and he probably got it from his father. But he realized that it's not time until he gets what he needs, so he will pretend to be an ordinary 12-year-old boy with simple thoughts and desires. And so I had to answer what a child would answer. He replied that perhaps it was because he was a talented sorcerer, because people were always saying that he was better at magic than anyone else. The chief folded his arms across his chest and said, "You think? Is it because of your talent?" And then the room fell silent, as the young man had to think about these words and formulate his answer. The prince, who was still in the room, even thought about these words, but did not say a word. But it was at this moment that he turned to his father, and when he heard his son's voice, he turned his head to find out what he wanted. Then the man said that Ian was just a child. What could he possibly understand now? This surprised His Majesty, because it was the first time he had ever seen a prince stand up for someone. After all, he does not have the kind of character to interfere in anything. Because of this, the boss decided to support his son's position, as it might give him some confidence in himself and his words. So he answered with a short and clear, "That's right." The chief then said that he had invited the young man here because of his skills. The other sorcerers and knights who accompanied him were very surprised by his talent. He also served the state by catching a foreign spy. And all children are entitled to a reward for good deeds. So the gentleman asked what the boy wanted to get. The blonde began to think that the kindness of the current emperor knew no bounds, so here was his chance. But he said out loud that he had already thought about it. Then he emphasized in his head that he was a child now, and if he were older, he could ask for something more valuable. So he said out loud that he wanted to see everything here. His Majesty was a little surprised by this, so he asked again, "To see?" The sorcerer added that he wanted to see the castle from the inside, how beautiful it was, and then share his impressions with his mother. The prince turned to his father again and said that on the way here, the young man had asked to see the ruins of the old tower. He added that all children are curious at a young age. The chief replied that if that was the case, he didn't mind and would make an order right away so that he could fulfill his wish in peace. Then one of his Majesty's aides showed the boy the object, and the chief said that by showing this sign, he would be able to pass through any room of the castle. The sorcerer could also ask the guards to show him where everything was. The young man picked up the card, which looked very beautiful and golden. Finally, His Majesty asked if he had any other wishes. The young man looked down and smiled sweetly, and replied that he had nothing more to dream about. But the chief smilingly said that for once, he would reward the sorcerer at his own discretion. After all, his wish seemed quite ordinary. And immediately after these words, he said one word, "Bring it in." And maids began to enter the room, holding something in their hands. It turns out that it was a chest of gold. It was completely filled with gold coins. Then His Majesty said that these maids who came in would go to the Blonde Manor. He emphasized that they had been working there for a long time, so there should be no problems. Hearing these words, the young man immediately began to think that now his mother would not have to worry about cleaning. He thanked His Majesty for his generosity. After the meeting, the sorcerer went out into the corridor and slowly closed the door behind him and stopped for a few seconds to calm down, and to conclude that this gentleman is indeed a very great man. He also did not expect to receive sympathy in his direction. He had this feeling of being checked and suspected. That's why you need to be resilient. He also had to be on his guard when talking to anyone in the place, especially Ragnar. However, he remembered that he needed to take care of something, because there was little time left. So he headed for the royal garden. When a guard stood in the way, the guy pulled out a sign and said that His Majesty had told him to show it to him. Seeing this, the subordinate replied that he would show him around. Then, once inside, the young man decided that he would pretend to look at the local buildings. However, he was very happy to finally be in the royal sanctuary. After all, he loves this place very much because he spent a long period of time here in his past life. In some moments, he was happy, and no one else but the royal family has the right to come here, to the place where his ancestors rest. One day I will be here, but it is still a long way off. These words were spoken by Ragnar. The wizard decided to go down into one of the dungeons. However, he was a bit frightened by a strange and loud sound. It turns out that it was a security guard who was on duty that day. He found it so boring that he even fell asleep. But the young man decided to use the magic of sleep just in case, so that the man would not wake up and find him here. Then the boy used the magic of light, which spread around with the help of a ball hovering above his palm. And he was looking for something that was supposed to be near the grave of the first emperor. But for some reason, walking through the halls, the young man could not find what he was looking for. So he passed by the same place several times. Finally, he found a mushroom with a stone heart. There were several of them, and they turned out to be very useful to the sorcerer. Using an ice spear, he cut them off and began to hide them in his cloth bag, and what he had gained would be enough. Suddenly, he heard an unfamiliar voice say, "What are you doing here at this hour?" This scared the young man because he did not expect anyone to catch him here. It was also possible that the magic had not worked and the guard had woken up. So he decided to quickly extinguish his light so as not to draw attention to himself once again. He decided to hide. When he was standing near one of the big columns, he heard two people talking about something, and they were in great humor. It turns out that he was a guy a little older than the sorcerer. He had brown hair. Walking down the stairs, he addressed the princess with a serious expression. Hearing these words, the blond man repeated to himself, "A princess?" And he began to analyze that there were 3 princesses in the royal family, and of course, not one of them was Ragnar. Then he heard the voice of a young lady who said quietly that no one comes here and it is quite quiet, and that she does not have prying ears. A second later, she added that she had come here because her duty as a princess required it. Then she turned to Mr. Kevin and said that he really wanted to test the sanctuary's security. And then the blonde realized from the voice that it was Haley Greenriver, who is the sister of the prince consort. So he turned his gaze to her to get a better look. But for some reason, the young man was very nervous because he was worried that someone would report it to the tower and then they would not be able to wash it off. Then the woman drew her eyebrows together and said angrily, "Doesn't the interlocutor know how dangerous the tower is?" Then the young lady joyfully folded her hands in prayer and said that her relatives would understand because she was doing this for the sake of her father and brother. The guy who came with her watched in silence, and looking down, he smiled slightly and agreed to continue to try to help the princess because they had already come such a long way together. So turning to the lady, he asked her if she remembered the techniques they had learned last time. The woman quickly and clearly replied, "Of course I remember." The young man asked her to start with the light. The woman said she would try it now, but first she would concentrate the mana. And literally a second later, she succeeded. When the sorcerer saw this, he was surprised that the princess had magic. And the princess asked her assistant why she had made such a small ball of light. The guy answered that she was still a beginner in this business. Hailey Trinriver is a woman who has lived her life quietly, like a caged bird. She followed her brother, the successive prince, after Ragnar took the throne and executed him. In his past life, Ian did not know that the young lady was a witch. However, he does not understand why she hides it from everyone. It's not clear to the young man yet. However, the independent study of magic, as well as the concealment of magical skills, is punishable by law, and her sorcerer cannot help but know about it. Then the princess asked her assistant to teach her the magic of protecting a volcano or something else. However, the gentleman replied that it was a difficult spell for him as well. Suddenly, a strange sound caught the lady's attention, and she froze in her tracks and listened. The boy did not understand what was happening, so he asked His Majesty what had happened. At this time, the young lady's mind was racing with thoughts of what if they were noticed. Then they would not get out of trouble. When the boy realized, he nervously said that they had to leave immediately. The princess smilingly asked her assistant to calm down. She added that only her family members can come here. After all, this place is considered sacred to them, so you don't have to worry so much. When the sorcerer had already left the room and was looking at her on the street, he realized that today he had witnessed a very unique situation, but no one could have known that the princess was a witch. Therefore, he needs to think carefully about what he has seen, because in this life, it can benefit him. She probably hides her capabilities because she knows that the owner of the tower supports Ragnar, and there is simply no need to demonstrate to everyone what she is capable of. The sorcerer's trip to the sanctuary took a little longer than he had expected, and when he was finally leaving, he was approached by a guard who asked if he was finished. But it was for the best, because he found what he really wanted. Turning his head to his interlocutor and smiling sweetly, he answered, "Yes. Thank you." Immediately after his little trip, the young man decided to return to his new home. After all, his mother is waiting for him here, and he wants to spend as much time as possible with her. When he entered the room, he was greeted by the alchemist he had brought with him, so he went to him first. As Ian came closer, he asked where his mother and the others were. The man replied that Mrs. Pade was talking to her assistants, and Douglas was looking at the estate that would be his new home. The sorcerer heard this information and said that it was to their advantage. These words surprised the alchemist, who did not yet understand what Mr. Ian meant. Then the sorcerer asked his companion if they could talk. After receiving a positive answer, the young man closed the door behind him so that no one could hear their conversation. And when they were alone, the blond man told the alchemist that he wanted him to prepare an elixir. He said these words with a serious expression on his face, which symbolized important intentions. The man listened attentively and asked what kind of elixir he should prepare. However, he still did not fully understand why the young man needed it. The sorcerer took out a bag in which he demonstrated mushrooms with a stone heart. They can paralyze a person and stop the heart. The gentleman listened to this information carefully. Then the gentleman asked if the sorcerer really wanted him to prepare a medicine from such a dangerous ingredient, because it was poison, and he didn't really want to be responsible for someone's death. but Ian asked if the gentleman knew about the magic of interrogation. Of course, the man did not know, so he remained silent for a few seconds, not knowing whether to tell the truth or lie. However, he recalled that he had been told about this when he was a teenager, so he replied that he knew what his interlocutor was talking about, but you could see the sadness on his face. So the blonde man went on to say that he needed an elixir that would help him bypass this magic. The alchemist was again surprised by this information because he did not expect to receive such a request, and he asked if the alchemist could do it. The man replied that he would first need to conduct certain experiments to obtain the final product. Ian replied that the better, the better. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door and interrupted the conversation between the two men. The sorcerer turned his head toward the door to see who it was. Someone who was there said that Ian had received a letter from the ivory tower, so the young man quickly went to the door and opened it to read it. For a few seconds, the boy held the letter in his hands and wondered whether he should open it right now or after meeting his mother, since they hadn't seen each other for almost a whole day. But I decided to read it anyway. The text was as follows. Newly arrived wizard Ian Page, we are also looking forward to meeting you. According to the rules, you are required to attend training at the tower. We fully recognize your talent for magic. Exactly 1 week from now, there will be an official meeting in the tower. Because you are the wizard of the tower, we hope you will attend. And when the alchemist heard the word week, he became worried, because for him it was not enough time. So the sorcerer turned his head to his assistant and asked him if he could cope with the task he was facing. The man replied, a week at a time. He added that he would just stay awake and do his best. Ian was very pleased with these words and said that he was relying on the alchemist. And now a whole week has passed, and the sorcerer has already set out on his way to the Tower of the Elephant's Braid, where an official meeting will take place, which he must attend. As he rode in the carriage, he thought about how he should behave so as not to damage his reputation. After all, he still had a lot of work to do here. Then he took out a small flask and, looking at it, began to think about whether the effect of this elixir should last for 2 hours. And during this time, he should be able to accomplish everything he had planned. Then he turned his gaze to the window and began to look at the road they were traveling to the tower. But his mind kept thinking about what he should do. A few minutes later, through the window, he saw that big, beautiful building that was only a little bit away. And there, he would be met by people who needed to be treated properly. However, he realizes that this tower holds many memories from his past life, and sometimes he even misses the way he lived in the past. But he came back to her anyway, so everything in this life would be better than before. When he arrived at the main entrance, he was met by a man who addressed him as Mr. Ian Page. It turns out that it was a nice young lady. She had 2 braided hair and wore round, large glasses. With her arms folded in front of her, she greeted the guest affectionately. And then, with a sincere smile, she told the young man to follow her, because she would take him to the owner of the tower. After all, that was why she had been sent here. When they entered through the large door, the young lady turned to the guest and said that the first floor was called the Hall of Enlightenment. Then they stopped in the middle of the room and began to look at what they saw together. The young man tried to memorize everything. However, a second later, Ian realized that the years had not changed this place at all, and it was unlikely to change in the future. That's why everything here is very familiar to him. Suddenly, this awkward silence was interrupted by an assistant who asked the sorcerer if he could see a golden disc a few meters away. The blonde answered that he could see it, and after this answer, the girl said that it was Manalift, and with the help of it, wizards move between floors. And on it, high-ranking sorcerers climb to the very top floor, and she invited the young man to try it, because that's where the owner of the tower would be waiting for him. And immediately, this disc lit up, and Ian began to look around to show his surprise at the device, even though he had seen it before. As the sorcerer moved between floors, he took out the small flask to examine its contents again. After all, he didn't have much time left to take it, and just in the last seconds, he managed to drink the elixir. And having stopped on the top floor, the young man froze to feel those strange sensations after taking it. But his attention was also drawn to what was right in front of his face, and he was excited, so he still needed to control his emotions. It turns out that he is separated from the meeting by a large metal door. He needs to go through it and finally hold the meeting he had been preparing for almost a week. Suddenly, the door slowly opened, and a voice from inside addressed the guest by name and invited him to enter. So he began to walk cautiously. The owner of the tower sat in his luxurious chair and smiled sweetly. saying that he was very happy that the sorcerer had accepted their invitation to meet. Then the man pointed to a chair next to his desk and told Ian not to stand by the door and to come in and make himself comfortable and feel at home. He added that he understood that he was a little nervous. After all, as it turned out, there was a group of people in the room who were sitting on chairs and looking at the guest ambiguously, but there is no point in worrying about it. However, these words did not dispel those worries and anxious thoughts. On the contrary, it became even more frightening to somehow express myself. And then the chief said that all the wizards of the tower had undergone the same rite. As he sat down in his chair, the young man thought that the distrust of these people was noticeable. The gray-haired gentleman went on to say that they fully recognized Ian's talent, but he seemed rather unusual. This made them suspicious. After all sorcerers are much closer to each other than blood relatives. Therefore, there is no place for distrust among them. The boy put his hands on the circle and listened attentively. After these words, the young man with a naive expression asked the chief a question that read as follows: "Are you going to interrogate me?" He did this to demonstrate himself as a child. The man folded both his arms across his chest and replied that they really looked so scary. And he added that such barbaric methods were not their thing. But the boy would have to answer the questions. And immediately after that, he suggested that we start so that we could get it over with and have a normal conversation. Ian Page was born in 488 under the sign of the Red Goat. His father is a merchant, Fran Page, and his mother is a cook, Vanessa Page. And in the end, the question was asked, "Is all this true?" The sorcerer answered that it was. The next question was asked by an older man with a gray mustache, and it read as follows: "We are interested in the reason for your connections with the alchemist Ledio." Ian looked down and replied that his mother was sick and needed to take medicine all the time, and the Lord advised him to hire an alchemist to be with her all the time. The following question was asked: "Why did you go to the ruins of the old tower?" The boy turned his head to the person who asked and replied that he had seen these ruins in books and had been dreaming of seeing them with his own eyes. After that, the man who sat farthest away, folding his arms across his chest, asked in a serious tone whether the young man remembered the sorceress Cecilia. The young man answered briefly and clearly, "Of course." Then the gentleman continued to say that he had noticed that she was dating someone, and when she saw him, she tried to kill him. And in the end, he asked if it was true. The blonde man replied that this was exactly what happened, and that at that moment, he thought he was going to die. The next question was asked by a woman who raised her right hand to his beard and asked if he had ever studied magic before. Ian replied that he had not. But then a logical question arose. How did the guy know how to use spells like the one that made him look like a fireball? And a freezing explosion. After all, this is exactly the kind of knowledge that future magicians acquire while studying at the academy, and no one has ever managed to do it on their own. And finally, there was a clarification that they wanted to get a convincing answer to this question, but it didn't work out that way. Or it happened by accident. Or, I don't understand how it happened. With a sad expression on his face, the young man confidently replied that he had been thinking about what he wanted, and it began to manifest itself not only in his thoughts. For example, fire in your palms. And so it was until one day it manifested, and it surprised him quite a bit. One of the adult sorcerers got angry because he did not like this answer, so he angrily began to shout that this was impossible and that it all looked like nonsense. And then the room fell silent. No one knew how to react. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but there was still some tension. The chief put his head in his hands and thought that they had used the magic of interrogation, and because of this, they could not assume that the guy was lying to them. He went on to suggest that the first sorcerer, of whom legends tell, could have been disguised as a child, or this young man of the highest rank who could suppress the magic of interrogation. However, this is not possible because he is so young, so the man is very curious to know who this guy is and what he can offer them next. However, this uncomfortable silence was interrupted by a woman who abruptly rose to her feet and loudly said to stop this performance. The lady had bright red hair. Then she said that it was enough to ask stupid questions. She suggested that they finally ask what they were all here for. The other sorcerers began to calm the young lady, named Helen, reminding her that the owner of the tower was still present in the room. However, this had no effect on her. So she put her right hand to her side and came closer to the young man and asked him the question, Who are you anyway? After all, this question worries everyone present. A second later, she added that she had had enough of these lying answers. Is that why she suggested that the guy finally tell her who he is? Because her patience was running out. She also asked why the sorcerer was lying to them all. As the lady spoke, the blonde realized that she was the same as she had been in his past life. Helen was the youngest sorceress of the 4th rank before he appeared. She was nicknamed the Lady of Fire for her fiery temper, and in that life, he liked such character traits very much. After such an emotional speech, the guy with wide-open eyes asked his interlocutor a question that clarified what she didn't know. With red-haired eyebrows, she asked in surprise, "What?" because she did not understand what the young man meant. And he said that everything was written in the certificate. And he said, Ian Page, born in 1948, a red goat. And at the end, he asked if the young lady could read. After these words, the woman simply exploded, along with her emotions. She clenched her teeth, drew her eyebrows together, and her eyes turned red. So she asked if the guy was thinking of making fun of her. However, this fight was stopped by the boss, who was still sitting at his desk and watching this action. So when things were getting out of hand, he ordered them to stop. And immediately after that, he began to stare at their guest. And then, calling him by name, he said that he would ask him one last question. And he began to say that on the day of the inspection, he had a conflict with a soldier. The soldier did not behave properly with his mother. The man then reminded them that the gentleman's name was Jonathan, and that he had been a bit arrogant toward them. The sorcerer showed that he did not yet understand what was going to be discussed. But the chief continued to say that the next day after the incident, the soldier died, or to be more precise, he was found in the river. And during the examination of the body, traces of mana were found. And at the very end, the head of the tower asked if he could relate the incident to him. And then a blue light appeared in his eyes, which symbolized that he was getting tense. The young man lowered his head and looked down for a few seconds, and began to think that there was a reason why this man was appointed the head of the tower. After all, he could skillfully bring everyone to light. And he never relied on magic alone. He was always thinking critically and questioning everything. And he tried to understand everything to the end, rather than immediately accuse. An ordinary person would be confused if they were accused of murder. The thought flashed through his mind that if he remained calm, they would definitely start to suspect something. So he realized that since this was the last question, it might be time to get rid of the medication he had taken a few hours earlier. However, this decision had to be made. But then the question arose that he might have to answer what they wanted him to say. So he put his hand on his heart and answered that he knew nothing about it. This answer made all the sorcerers present rise to their feet, because they clearly did not expect this and needed to release their emotions at least somehow. Everyone was looking at the young man, who was sitting facing the main tower, because it was by looking at him that he was supposed to answer the question. The gray-haired gentleman began to smile sweetly, saying that the boy's death had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with the soldier's death. The young man answered briefly and clearly, yes. After all, he had chosen this tactic, so he had no chance to retreat and had to stick to his appointed plan. So the chief looked down and said that it was good, because the young man could not have done something like that. He apologized for asking such a rude question. But he decided to admit that he had made up the fact that traces of mana were found on the body, because that was what was supposed to bring the guy to the cleaners, as if he had used his powers carelessly. And in fact, the soldier fell off the bridge and simply drowned, unable to get to his feet. The blonde tried to listen carefully to this information. He added that he understands that lying is bad, and he hopes for understanding, because every sorcerer present here has gone through this rite. Therefore, the chief assumes that the guest himself understands that his case is an exception for the ivory tower, and they know nothing about his power. That's why they need to fix this situation. They need to find out not only what they are capable of now, but also what they will be capable of in the future. Then the head of the tower began to tell him that right in front of the boy was a mana storehouse, and it is the main source of this building's power. Now its color is neutral, but the more mana he collects, the more blue it becomes. So the boss asked the young man to direct his mana there. Did Ian specify whether it was all of it? The owner of the tower said yes. After all the wizards present want to see everything, and to draw a certain conclusion for themselves, because it's already taken a long time. The young man, approaching the balloon, remembered that the storehouse could be filled with mana to the 3rd grade, and it would be better for him to fill it up to the second. After all, if he shows them as much as the sorcerers want to see, they will finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, it is not yet clear why he would do this. After all, he was an 8th grade sorcerer, but his name will not remain in history, and they will not write wise leader or great leader next to him. Ian has always lived because the situation demanded it, so this time he doesn't care about power, authority, or honor because he doesn't need them. And standing next to the ball, he tried to gather all his mana and direct it into it, and gradually the object changed its color from neutral to blue. And at that moment, he realized that magic was more precious to him than anything else, and there is no one stronger than him. That's why he is going to demonstrate it to everyone. In 1 second, the ball began to crack, because its frame could no longer withstand the influx of mana that Ian had sent into it. It just shattered into small pieces all over the room. All those present instinctively raised their hands to their faces to protect them. After all, such debris could easily injure them. They were also all quite surprised. After this incident, the young man leaned over the balloon and began to cough loudly, because he had to use a lot of his strength to do this. And given that he is still a child, this is a lot for him. The owner of the tower sat there for a few minutes with his mouth wide open, because he hadn't expected to see such a level from such a young sorcerer either. And now, he didn't know what to do next. After the dust settled, the other people present also froze in their seats and looked attentively at their guest with wide open mouths and eyes. Only the young lady with red hair was able to express her thoughts out loud, namely, how is this even possible? After all, she thought he was a third-ranked sorcerer, but his level exceeded their expectations. During this time, he was able to regain some of his strength to strike a confident pose to show his best. When everyone had taken their seats, one of the men rose abruptly to his feet, slammed his fist on the table, and said that the rumors about Ian Page were true. On top of that, he was not a third, but a fourth-level sorcerer. Then he turned to the owner of the tower and said that he was the only one here who was no match for this young man. Then the sorcerer asked if everyone had seen Ian's face when he lied about killing Jonathan's soldier, or whatever his name was. The gentleman was very outraged by the situation, so he turned to his friends in anger and asked them if they understood what this could mean. The ivory tower must lure him to their side and tame him before he turns into a real monster that can do a lot of damage. But he doesn't need to go to an academy and have his mana checked for 5 years in the provinces. The owner of the tower said he thought so too. She agrees that Ian should not enter the academy. After all, he will become a problem for other students who are just starting their way in this direction. Because if they are wizards of the highest class, they feel uncomfortable. So it's hard to imagine how they'll feel when they see all the possibilities of this young man. Then the gray-haired leader said that it didn't matter whether Ian Page killed that soldier or helped him die. That was not the problem. The main thing is that the magic of interrogation works, and they will always be able to find out whether he is lying or not. So the man thinks that he doesn't need to remind everyone how important it is to maintain the ivory tower's reputation, because they can't fall face first into the mud. And everyone should also remember that the stronger their sorcerers are, the stronger the tower itself will be. Therefore, they all need to unite and combine their powers. Because of this, the head of the tower proposed that Ian Page be recognized as the 12th Arch-Wizard and officially declared a 4th-class wizard. Also, given his young age, he should receive individualized training from a higher-class sorcerer. Finally, he asked if everyone agreed with this opinion. The people who were present during this speech all said yes. This made the gray-haired man very happy, so the man immediately asked who among those present was ready to start studying. At that moment, Ian did not expect to be recognized as an arch-wizard so quickly and asked to come here again. Although he already had such assumptions in his head, even by his standards, everything happened too quickly. So before he could recover, he had to start working. And when he came to the ivory tower the next day, he stood there for a few seconds, looking at it in peace. However, he was greeted again by the young lady he had seen the first time he met her. The young man looked her straight in the eye and smiled sweetly, and said that they had met again. And the lady, with her arms folded in front of her, replied that she had heard that he was recognized as a 4th-level sorcerer. Hearing these words, Ian began to smile, for he did not know how to react to such words. Then the young lady put her hands to her mouth and said, with a little shudder, that the boy was simply incredible. After all, he is only 12 years old, and he is already an arch-wizard. So she added that all the rumors about him were true. The blonde man asked the woman what those rumors were. The girl said that he might not have been informed yet, but she had been appointed his assistant for the next year. And finally, she added that she hoped they would get along. Ian told me that I shouldn't call him by his first name. After all, he is younger. When the assistant heard these words, she simply exploded with happiness because the young man, who was a 4th-level sorcerer, considered her older and more experienced. Since he thought so, she was obliged to give him a tour and show him around. A few hours later, the girl brought the boy to the building of the Magic Academy. Then she turned her gaze to her interlocutor and said that he would have studied with her, but with his incredible skills, he would need a personal mentor. As they walked, the young man thought that this was a very funny-looking personal mentor. He was probably going to brainwash him into taking the side of the tower, and he was sure that this was the intention of its owner. When they came to the place they needed, what they saw surprised the guy a little bit, and he froze in place and said with a wide open mouth, "Ooh!" After all, he saw his friends from his past life standing in a group at that very moment, listening attentively to the teacher who was telling them some things about magic. Watching them, Ian said to himself that in his past life, he had stood next to them and gone through all the training just like they are now. And in a previous life, they were all killed by spies from Coldwood during the First Unification War, so I just didn't expect to see them alive and well again. After these thoughts, the young man smiled sweetly, because the thought crossed his mind that although there was a big gap between them now, they might still be able to talk. Then they began walking with the assistant again along the long, large corridors, and suddenly she stopped and pointed to the right at the door and said that his study room was there. A second later, she added that she used the magic of cleaning to make sure there was not a single speck of dust and that Ian could feel normal while studying. After these words, the girl carefully and slowly began to open the door inside so that they could go in and carefully examine everything with their sorcerer. As soon as he entered, he looked around and realized that this was the room. Then the assistant began to tell me that 300 years ago, when the new tower was founded, there were 24 wizards with levels from the 4th grade. Now there are much fewer of them, so most of the rooms are empty. The lady then smiled broadly and added with a kind expression that the owner of the tower had allowed Ian to use the room for his own practice. After saying this, the girl turned to the door and asked the sorcerer to wait a little while because she would go and bring his teacher. And as soon as the door closed behind the assistant, he began to think that it had been a long time since he had been here. And just now, a small pile of memories from his past life came flooding back to him. Then he walked over to the large wooden table where he had been able to sit before, but not in such a respectable status as this time. After all, in this life, he got the room 7 years earlier. Since he was recognized as an arch-wizard at such a young age, his path has now been revealed. This is why it is necessary to consolidate his influence in the tower during the next 6 years, because when he came here, the young man had already developed a certain plan of action. In a previous life, the tower completely sided with Ragnar. Therefore, he needs to strengthen his position before it happens again. And for this, he will need a lot of power to stop the owner of the tower and his influence on Ragnar. Ian has to subdue the influence of the tower, which was constantly on the case of its owner, and he must gain attention to himself in order to reach the level of the tower owner and even overcome him, and he can do this only by taking control of the tower. For now, he will just pretend to be a little boy. For now, he is too weak physically and too young. He won't even make it to the 5th grade. These thoughts were interrupted by the sound of feet entering the room through the large door, and then a woman's voice was heard saying, "Hello." When Ian saw her, he was very surprised to see who it was. After all, he did not understand why the sorcerers sent her. It turns out that it was the same red-haired young lady who opened the door very strongly and sharply saying, "Long time no see." After she said that, she began to smile sweetly because she realized that they would have to spend a lot of time together and that they needed a good atmosphere for that. But she still couldn't say, "Little liar." And then she decided to say hello, but she hadn't had a chance to do that since she arrived. The young man still couldn't understand why she was sent. He had not expected to work with her. He decided to make her a little angry by asking her if she was the one who needed to collect the pieces of the mana storehouse. The woman replied that she thought he had become a little more impudent. Then the red-haired woman began to move toward her interlocutor, saying something that suggested that he knew most of the Academy's program. The young man listened to all these words very carefully. Then she began to list the etiquette, the history of the tower, the theory of magic, and everything that was taught at the Academy. Even so, the tower owner decided to assign Ian a personal teacher, because it would be difficult for ordinary students to learn alongside the guy. After all, he already knows quite a bit about various kinds of magic. After that, the woman pointed her index finger forward and a book began to move quickly toward her. She said, "What good is it?" Then the young lady threw the book aside, saying that books were not her thing. After all, in her opinion, this should be done by slightly older people. Then she tilted her head slightly forward toward the young man and put her hands to her sides and said that he had managed to catch Cecilia, because she proved herself well in the battle, and the girl had high hopes for her. If she hadn't turned out to be a spy, her skills as a sorceress would have surpassed many of the people here. But fortunately, Ian managed to figure out the traitor and even caught her himself. And this already inspires a lot of respect for him. Then the lady turned her back on the boy and said that since she was his teacher, she would try to teach him something. And she began to tell me that there are actually several types of sorcerers. The first type is warrior sorcerers. The second type is sorcerer's assistants. And the third type is the researcher. Then the girl closed her eyes and added that the rest of the sorcerers were just excuses that could be ignored and not even paid attention to. Finally, she decided to ask the young man what species he thought she was. This question made him a little nervous. So he was silent for a few seconds, and then quietly replied that his teacher was of the first type. Upon receiving this answer, the young lady began to smile and said that she was indeed the best of her kind. And no matter what anyone says or tries to prove her skills on a completely different level, and no one can argue with this because she has decided to do so herself, and it is beyond question. Then the lady began to move around her ward, looking intently into his face, and said in a mysterious tone that she had her own methods of teaching, so she said they should go elsewhere. She added that she would not take no for an answer. Ian listened attentively, but it took him a few seconds to think about the offer and make a decision. They moved to a place near a dense, beautiful forest, but it was fenced with a brick fence with large columns. When they found themselves in the center of the playground, the girl spread her arms to the sides and asked him happily if he had any idea what they were going to do. Without allowing her interlocutor to answer, the young lady said that she would teach him how to fight without a shadow of fear of death. In her opinion, this is a very important skill that needs to be taught right now. Ian continued to listen attentively. With a serious expression on his face, he watched all the actions of his mentor. At the same time, the thought ran through his mind that everything was going on as usual, because she had shown signs of attention to him in her previous life, although he didn't need them at all then. But this time, he decided to show her what he was capable of from the very beginning. Other students who were also present on the playground at that time, but at the other end, noticed these two, but did not yet understand who started this battle. And when they looked closely, they noticed Mr. Ian. One of them even asked if it was too dangerous to fight with Ms. Helen. When the girl saw that they were being watched, she put her right hand to her side and smilingly said that enough spectators had already gathered, so they could begin. A second later, she told the young man that he would have the first move, because if she did it first, it would look bad, because she was a teacher after all. Ian slowly took off his cloak, which was fastened around his neck, and throwing it to the ground, he asked his now rival if she was sure she could handle it. The red-haired girl tilted her head to the side and asked sarcastically whether the guy was suggesting that she start worrying or what he meant. Upon hearing this answer, the young man said that he understood and that he would not give in, and he immediately stretched his right hand forward to use some magic. Then the young man closed his eyes to better concentrate on using the magic he needed right now for the first strike. After all, he could not lose this battle. The mentor also wasted no time in using the magic of fire, for a bright orange color was already flashing around her. And looking at her opponent, she said that she was advising him to create a shield to protect himself and conduct defense. And in my head at that time, thoughts were simply replacing each other at the speed of light. One of them was that whatever he was, she will destroy him anyway. After all, in her opinion, he definitely lied to them during the meeting, where all the sorcerers arranged a certain interrogation. However, what she saw next surprised her, because Ian had used an ice block that completely covered his body and made it difficult to approach him. What she saw made the young lady freeze in her tracks and open her mouth wide, because she clearly did not expect such a development. So she asked if he really decided to play a joke on her. Then the lady came closer to the opponent and tapped on the ice and asked why he chose the ice block out of all the techniques. And the next question was whether he was going to sit there until he used up all the mana. Ice Block is one of the best spells in defense magic. However, its drawback is that the caster falls asleep and cannot use other techniques. Then the young lady spread her arms to the side and said that she did not yet understand what the sorcerer's plan was, but what she could demand from such a young boy. Immediately after these words, a strange sound attracted the young lady's attention, and she instinctively began to look around to see what might be threatening her. The other students also froze in their seats in surprise because they had never heard anything like this before, and it scared them because they didn't know what it could be. The red-haired woman suddenly froze in place as well because what she noticed next surprised her, so much so that she even opened her mouth wide, because it was just, really, impossible. Or, to be more precise, how this young man was able to move in the ice block. Then a large, long, green vegetation began to sprout around the rival, and she watched this for a few seconds, and she realized that this would cause her a lot of trouble. So, in a fit of emotion, she gritted her teeth and angrily said, "Damn." Everyone who was even a few miles away could see this green vegetation. It was already taller than the building that had been constructed on the site. The woman tried to use the magic of fire to neutralize the vegetation because she believed that she had to defeat this arrogant young man. However, things were not so simple, and the woman angrily told them to burn and to stop appearing. After all, something was happening that she might lose. Therefore, it is necessary to find a way for her to at least survive and get out of the water. Meanwhile, the blonde man stood calmly in the ice protection, and the young lady began to think about how she could get it out of this ice block, which completely protects it from any impact. But it is not yet clear how to approach a sorcerer who is not only able to move in a block, but also uses spells. She has never seen anything like this in her life. While the woman was thinking about all this, new vegetation appeared next to her and began to move directly toward her. And then she grabbed the witch by the throat and began to tighten her noose, and this did not allow the young lady to breathe normally. So she started coughing loudly because she didn't have enough oxygen. And when she saw the blonde man walking toward her, she looked down and said that she now understood why he was called the reincarnation of the first sorcerer. Then she decided to take control of herself and her emotions and said with a sweet smile that she was giving up and he had won. He could let her go now. Ian smiled back, but it was a sneering emotion, after which he said that he was still counting the minutes. It would be a shame to end the fight like that. The young lady asked, "What?" in surprise. To clarify the situation a bit, the red-haired young lady smiled nervously again and asked what he meant. After all, she had already lost. What more did he want? However, this did not affect the guy, and he looked at his opponent and slowly raised his right hand and began to use some magic, which controls the clouds and the wind. Seeing this, the woman quietly said, "Stop. Liar. Ian?" She really wanted it to stop and she could control her body normally. And when she saw that the guy did not hear her at all, she began to shout even louder, saying that this was just a training session. So she tried to order him to stop immediately. However, the sorcerer took a position in front of his opponent and stretched his right hand forward to call for lightning, in order to strike the young lady with it and show who was the boss. Other sorcerers, who were also on the training ground at the time, but in a different corner, all of them were surprised to see the young man's next actions, as they had not expected such a development. As it turned out, the lightning struck the vegetation below, which was holding the woman's legs. She was very happy to be alive and unharmed. Then the young man came closer to the woman and crouched down to look her in the eye. The red-haired woman was already so frightened that she began to scream for him to stay away from her. However, the young man said in a sweet and calm tone, "Ms. Helen ... This calmed her down a bit, but she still felt a little nervous, not knowing what to expect from him. And did he continue, or did she think she had more to teach him? After all, he had already demonstrated his skills to the young lady, so she should think carefully about her answer. And because of this, there was silence between them for several minutes, because the woman did not know what she should say to her student, whom she had to teach something, and he took her and defeated her in a battle. At that moment, the young lady felt very ashamed of herself, so she put her head down and began to shake it slowly from side to side, symbolizing that she had nothing to give him. And after receiving this answer, the boy asked for permission to go to rest. And immediately after that, he turned his back on his teacher and did so. The sorcerer disciples were still standing in the places where they had frozen a little earlier, and Ian was moving toward them, asking for forgiveness. He asked them to disperse because he was very tired and wanted to go to rest as soon as possible, and they were blocking his way. Several days have passed since the incident. and an important meeting was planned in the ivory tower. The owner of the tower was already in a hurry to get there, but at the same time he was asking his assistant how Helena was doing, because they hadn't seen each other since the day he sent her to teach Ian. The young man sadly bowed his head and replied that it was very bad, because he had been refusing to eat for several days, and that's why he can't recover his strength. At that time, the thought flashed through the leader's mind that losing to a 12-year-old boy was a disgrace. After all, he had sent Helen to break the spirit of this boy so that he would come over to his side, but in the end, she herself was broken. Therefore, taming the young man will not be as easy as he thought, because he is clearly not a domestic dog who is ready to be chained, but a free wolf who likes to manage his life and actions on his own. The gray-haired gentleman said to his assistant that he would need a little more time. The assistant nodded silently in response, because he was so upset that he could not get a word out. After a few minutes of this fast walking, the gentleman opened the door to one of the rooms where he was already waiting, and, with his hand on his heart, bowed his head in apology for being a little late. It turned out that the man had come to see His Majesty, who was dressed in a beautiful green jacket and beige pants. The gentleman leaned on the table and looked attentively at his guest, holding a book in his hands. His Majesty replied that it was okay, because he wasn't expecting much, and he had an appointment, so the Tower Master didn't have to worry about it. The young man then crossed his arms over his chest and asked the gentleman in a serious tone to tell him in detail about Ian Page, because this is quite an interesting person who appeared in their area. At that time, a meeting was taking place at the estate where the young sorcerer lived with his mother and the alchemist. The teenager approached his father and told him that he was ready to leave, to which he replied, "Let's go." After these words, they approached the blond man, and, addressing him by his first name, the alchemist said that he was going to take his son to the academy. The young man was very happy, because finally he would learn something new and not just sit at home and do nothing. So he smilingly added that they would be back soon. Ian couldn't understand why the boy was so excited about learning, because there are few children left today who are so eager to learn new things. And then the sorcerer remembered that today was the first day of classes. But he couldn't understand how he could have forgotten that. Instead of wishing the young man good luck, he just remained silent. It turns out that Douglas was accepted into the highest ranks of the Alchemical Academy, so it's obvious that he has talent, but it needs to be properly developed to have a certain result in the future. Ian continued to read the book with his head back in his chair. He reasoned that studying was easy enough for him because he had learned all the material long ago. So far, he had nothing to do with himself, and it was very bad and did not have a positive effect on his condition. He was bored and did not know what to do with himself. Since returning to the past, he hasn't had a moment to rest. Ragnar hasn't acted yet, but he won't be sitting still for long, and you need to be prepared for that. Therefore, ideally, you should train your body to increase your capabilities. The young man was thinking about this as he approached the mirror and looked at himself. But the next question immediately arose: can he completely relax and do nothing? Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the door. After the permission was granted, a maid came inside and brought an envelope on a tray and said that Mr. Ian had received an invitation from the castle, which he could examine for himself. When the sorcerer heard these words, he asked in surprise, "An invitation?" After all, he did not expect to be called back from those lands so soon. He also did not understand why and what had happened. So he decided to pick up the envelope to take a closer look at what was written there. For several seconds, he stood there looking at the paper in his hands. And then he realized that the seal on the envelope belonged to a follower of the prince. And this surprised him even more, because it raised more questions than it answered. And on the same day, but in the late afternoon, when the sun was already setting, Ian arrived at the estate for a meeting that was to take place, for some reason, at that particular time. When he got out of the carriage, the young man looked at the castle carefully and wondered why this gentleman had decided to invite him to this event, because, in his opinion, it looked very suspicious. After all, everyone knows that wizards who are not blood aristocrats are not allowed to enter the world. Therefore, it is not yet clear what this gentleman could have been thinking about when he made this offer. However, this was the first time that the prince took on the task of hosting a banquet. Previously, it had been the responsibility of his assistants and servants, who were well versed in these matters. Ian also recalled that the king's follower in his past life did not organize social gatherings because he was not in close relations with the nobility. Due to his passive approach to life, he was never able to make his debut in the politics of the empire and was not recognized in the highest circles. But the fifth prince was his complete opposite because he loved to socialize. And this is how he was able to consolidate his position by taking power into his own hands. It turns out that the emperor was the only one who remained on the side of the consistent prince, and so the man was able to influence his son. Therefore, what is about to happen is a very important event in the life of the sorcerer. He had never attended such social events before. He thought that he could sit quietly for a few minutes and then go home. And when he handed his invitation to the guard, he bowed and invited him to enter. As soon as the door began to open slowly and the young wizard was able to enter, all the eyes of the people present were riveted on him. People tried to hide the curiosity with which they were looking at him, but they did it very poorly, so you could see everything without looking closely. Seeing such a reaction, the young man realized that he felt out of place here, so he had to go home as soon as possible. Suddenly, one of the assistants loudly announced to the entire room in a serious tone that His Majesty the King's follower had arrived and would now enter the room to hold a meeting. And as soon as the last words were spoken, the door slowly began to open to the room, through which the prince was to enter. All those present at that moment froze in a bow, showing their respect. It turned out that the man had gone out on the balcony so that he could see everyone from the moon. The gentleman was dressed in a blue and white suit. You could see the satisfaction and joy on his face. Then he smiled sweetly and thanked everyone who came here because it was very important for him and, above all, for them. After all, important issues will be discussed today. He went on to say that, as everyone knew and saw, he was opening the banquet today in place of his father. The people who had come by invitation looked at His Majesty carefully and listened to everything in detail. But a second later, he added that before they started the meeting, he wanted to introduce someone to them because he had the opportunity. Therefore, after the prince had spoken, he turned his head to the right and began to stare at Ian, who, like everyone else, stood silently and listened attentively. And he did not expect that so much attention would be drawn to his personality today. So he was a little confused when everyone in the room turned their gaze to him. Then His Majesty spread his arms to the side and announced that this was his special guest, the fourth-class Archmage of the Ivory Tower, a native of the northern province of Mogrian, Ian Page. The young man did not know how to react to so much attention because he was not used to having so many people looking at him at the same time. Seeing this confusion, the prince again held his arms out to the side and shouted, asking Ian to stop and calm down a bit. After all, he was the reason why the meeting was organized. The guy sarcastically replied that he was surprised and very pleased. Then the young man closed his eyes to think things over, namely, that the prince had organized this circus to show the nobility that he was on his side, and he is simply convinced that the emperor planned it. Then His Majesty said that he had heard rumors about how well Ian had performed in the tower. He came and defeated a fourth-level sorcerer right off the bat, so you can only imagine how the locals felt. The prince went on to say that when he first saw him in Mogrian, he thought it would be difficult to work with him because he was very untidy. So it was at that moment that he was thinking about how to work with him. However, in the end, the blonde smiled sweetly, put his right hand on his side, and added that he was simply, just advised by such an outstanding talent, and he decided to offer to move in with them. And then he said something that put everything in its place, namely that his father had forced him to follow Ian, but he was happy that it was the way it was, not otherwise. Then the prince turned his head to the right and said that he had one more person he would like to introduce today, since everyone is here. And holding out his right hand, he smilingly invited his guest to enter the hall. Ian watched him closely, because he did not expect her to show up. After all, she had met him much later in her past life. So he was quite surprised, and you could see it in his expression. When the prince saw this, he turned to Ian and said that he wanted to introduce him to his younger sister, Hilary. The girl had blonde hair and was dressed in a blue, long dress. The young lady smiled sincerely and said in a small voice that she was very pleased to meet such a young wizard. She went on to say that her name was Healy River. After all, there is a lot of talk about him in the imperial court, and it turns out that he is now a real celebrity. The young man smiled back and said that he was very pleased to hear that. Folding her hands in front of her, the lady added that she had come today only to say hello, but next time she would like to meet him for lunch and discuss his life in Mogrian. The young man replied that he was afraid that he would only be able to tell her boring stories about monsters and magic. Haley said that he was very interested in everything. After all, she is interested not only in magic, but also in the lives of other people on Earth. That is why she is so eager to talk to him. Finally, she said that she would send him an invitation in the near future, and she added that she hoped he would enjoy today's party. Ian replied that he was very grateful for the princess's attention. Immediately after these words, the young lady turned around and began to walk toward the exit with her brother, who decided to escort her out so that no one could approach her. The sorcerer froze in his tracks, for something had forced him to think it over right now and not put it off until later. However, the girl decided not to leave the feast but to stay and talk to her friends. Meanwhile, Ian was thinking that Princess Hilary was not at all like the one he had seen in the sanctuary. Then the young man turned his gaze to the prince and emphasized that he was nervous, but still coping well with his duties. As long as no one was paying attention to him, the young man began to walk slowly toward the exit. So he decided to leave before he got even more bored here and to go home and talk to his mother. Then he went outside and held on to one of the large columns and breathed in the fresh air deeply because it was quite stuffy in the room. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a man who was also standing on the street, quietly looking at something in the dark. This made the young man turn to the guest. I said, "Knight Oliver?" And the black-haired man slowly turned his head to the one who spoke to him. His expression said that he was upset about something. Seeing his new interlocutor, the knight said, "Mr. Ian," in response. The sorcerer decided to come a little closer to continue the conversation. After taking a few steps, the young man said that the gentleman looked very nice in his tailcoat. The young man lowered his head and looked down and replied that His Majesty, the prince's successor, had ordered him to wear a formal outfit today, because he also has to look normal. After these words, an awkward silence fell between the two men, and for a few seconds, they just looked at each other. And the thought flashed through the sorcerer's mind that he had decided to go out on the terrace in vain. The black-haired gentleman decided to break the silence, so he said that he knew what the rumors were. Suddenly, Ian asked, "Rumors?" He wanted to provoke the other person to tell him what he knew, and it worked, because the knight began to say that there were rumors about Helen being an archwitch from the tower, and that he was able to defeat her in a single combat. And this surprised the young man a bit because the prince also mentioned it. To be more precise, I heard a rumor about how great and skillful you were in the tower. So he said that even a knight knows, but he said that the affairs of the tower did not go beyond him. The black-haired man smiled sweetly and said that if knights could not get important information, then what would be the point of having them at all, especially in this century? Since it is at this time that the Green River Empire is being defended by sorcerers, the knights have turned into assistants and decorations that speak of their owner's status. The man went on to add that he was very surprised that Ian had managed to defeat not just a fourth-class sorceress, but Helen the Firebender herself, which few people could defeat before. And this sowed some doubts that the young man was really a little boy. And finally, the gentleman added that His Majesty trusted Ian enough to invite him to a banquet for dignitaries. Then the knight knelt down on his right knee and looked the sorcerer straight in the eye and asked him whose side he was on, because enough time had passed to choose. Without giving me the opportunity to give any answer, the black-haired man said that he did not care who he was or how he had acquired such a talent at such a young age. But he knows that the Ivory Tower supports the fifth prince, and it's important for him to find out who Ian favors now, because he has been here for quite some time and could assess the situation. And a second later, he added another question. Could he also be on the side of the tower? The young man, given the opportunity, replied that such questions took him by surprise, so he asked who would be able to answer them out of the blue. The black-haired man looked down at the floor and said that he was the chief knight of His Majesty, and he had to know the answer now, because it might be too late later. At this time, a memory flashed through Ian's mind that Oliver Raywood was a knight who defended the prince's follower to the last and gave his life for him. But out loud, the young man replied that he hadn't made a definite decision yet. However, the thought again flashed through my mind that the interlocutor might not be satisfied with the answer. So he continued to say that he could assure him that he would never take the side of the fifth knight. The knight was quite surprised to hear this answer, because for some reason he had thought it might be the opposite, and so he froze in his seat and opened his mouth wide. Having mastered himself and his emotions, he began to turn his head from side to see if anyone else was near them. Seeing this, Ian reassured the black-haired man by saying that he had used magic and no one had heard them. Then the sorcerer smiled sweetly and asked if this answer would suit the knight. The knight was still on one knee, but he smiled back and replied, "It would be completely satisfactory." Finally, he thanked me for the conversation. But it didn't end there. The man immediately asked if he could ask for a favor. The blonde man was a bit alarmed, so he clarified what the other man had in mind, and the man said that before Ian chose a side, he wanted him to fight with him. After all, he needed to become a little stronger. These words calmed the boy down a bit, and he asked with a pleased expression if the knight really wanted to learn how to fight a sorcerer. A second later, he added that one day the same gentleman's sword might fight against him. The black-haired man listened carefully and said that he could not deny it. Upon receiving this answer, Ian began to laugh out loud, folding both arms across his chest and saying that the black man looked rather cruel in this case. But he still said that he would refuse such an offer above all else, because there was no benefit to him in it, because he likes any business to benefit both parties. Then the black-haired man raised his hands to his neck and began to slowly unbutton something and take it out. And when he held out his hands to Ian, he said that this chain, it was given to him by the Empress when he became His Majesty's personal knight. The sorcerer slowly looked down at the thing and began to examine it carefully. Then the black-haired man added that she told him that he was magical and helped to clear the mind of any bad thoughts. And at that moment, Ian remembered that this was indeed one of the lost imperial treasures. It belonged to the Empress, and in her past life, no one was able to find it. The knight said that he would give it to the sorcerer because the chain could be of more use to him than to the black-haired man. Ian opened his eyes wide in surprise, and then he said that it was a gift from the deceased Empress herself. Could he really say goodbye to it so easily? The man looked down again and said that she had asked him to protect her son. Then he added that training with Ian would help fulfill that request, so he was sure she would understand. An uncomfortable silence fell between the interlocutors again. After all, the sorcerer had to think it over thoroughly to draw a parallel between the pros and cons. So Ian said that if that was the case, he agreed to the offer, namely, to train with the knight. And saying these words, the young man took the chain. Suddenly, at that moment, a large and loud explosion occurred next to them, and everything around them lit up with a bright orange light. Then the two men turned their heads in the direction of the explosion. They did not realize that it had happened at all, so they froze in their seats for a few seconds. And when they saw what happened, they saw that the fire and dust were moving through the open door of the room. And then the knight realized that his boss was there in the middle. And because of this, he shouted, "His Majesty." You could see the fright in his expression. So he quickly got to his feet and ran inside. As he began to look around, he again began to call out for His Majesty, for he had not yet seen him. A few seconds later, the dust settled, and the captain was called by the chief. He was covering his sister behind his back and asked, frightened, what had happened at the estate. However, the man did not answer this question yet, as he was more concerned about whether His Majesty was injured. But the prince decided to reassure his assistant by saying that he was fine. Then the rest of the guards came running into the room, frightened and nervous, and asked the prince if he was okay. When they received the answer that everything was fine, they turned their heads to their captain and asked how he was. The man replied that he was fine, and he asked them to put it like the furnishings in the mansion. The young man began to report that an explosion had occurred on the territory of the estate, but the cause has not yet been established. But they have already sent a message via the emergency communication system and are waiting for confirmation from all posts. When Ian heard this answer, he began to wonder what kind of emergency call it was. And it turns out that this is a system that connects the soldier, the country, the estate, and the ivory tower. And in emergency situations, each post has to report the situation and urgently arrive at a certain meeting point. The guy put his head down and assumed that since the system was already up and running, all the wizards and soldiers should be here soon. And then a question arose in his mind. What if these disruptions were created for that purpose? So, to prevent anything bad from happening, the sorcerer decided to use the magic of the barrier. Then the blond man turned his head back and addressed His Majesty and asked if he could support the barrier with his mana. The girl asked, wide-eyed with surprise, "What?" She hadn't expected anyone to know about her powers, but the blond man said it was an emergency, so she had to give a clear answer. So the young lady slowly approached the sorcerer and said uncertainly that she had learned it, of course, but but she did not have time to finish because she was interrupted by a young man who took it as a consent. He immediately turned in the opposite direction and began to move quickly in that direction, and the princess stared silently after him for several seconds. The boy approached the maids, who were also quite frightened by what was happening in the estate. The young man asked them to tell him what to do. "Is there an assistant here named Isabel?" The women listened attentively to the request. One of the maids answered with her head down, "Yes." She also said that she wanted to visit the central mansion, which is why she came from another house. Hearing this information, the sorcerer quietly said that it was expected, and so they want to find Cecilia. The Cold Walkers plan to disrupt the Ivory Tower guards to get to Cecilia. They don't care about her life at all because they need information about it. Therefore, this cannot be allowed to happen, and he immediately began to think of a plan for his further actions. At this time, a secret person who was dressed in a black long cloak walked through the courtyard of the estate, and when she entered the prison where Cecilia was sitting, she said that she hadn't seen her for a long time and asked how she was living here. However, this person was unknown, even to the sorceress. So she asked him calmly and indifferently, "Who is he, and who let him in?" And then the young man lowered his hood and said that he was Daniel. He went on to say that he was a little disappointed because he thought the young lady was more capable. And then the woman realized who it was. So she quickly ran to the bars and clutched them tightly and began to shout loudly for the guy to finally release her. However, he was not going to do it so quickly. The young man held his hands out to the side and said in a calm tone that he would certainly do it. But first, he needed to clarify. And then Cecilia realized what the boy meant and immediately began to say quickly that she hadn't told them anything. But that boy, Ian Page, knew everything about the Cold Walkers and the orders they receive. The young man listened carefully and asked, "Is this information accurate?" Then the young lady raised her hand to her neck and added that the sorcerer even knew about the marks that she did not even know about. The young man folded his arms across his chest and said that almost all the Cold Walkers did not know about it and had only been told recently. So he asked what else she knew. Cecilia said that she hadn't learned anything else and asked if he could fire her. He didn't really want to do it right now, but he put his head down and said, "Okay." Immediately after these words, the door to the cell opened, and the young lady began to smile joyfully because she would finally be free. But it did not happen as she thought it would. The man drew his sword and stabbed the girl. A lot of blood flew in different directions, and Cecilia fell to the ground, coughing loudly. Finally, the young man said that the management had to think a lot about how to get into the tower and what to do with it. The girl held her cut throat and listened to what her friend was telling her, namely, that a third-class sorcerer had to be freed anyway. But they decided that they would not take her back alive, because she had already been here for quite a long time, and they could no longer trust her. After the girl fell face down on the ground and showed no signs of life, the young man smiled and told her to sleep peacefully. However, in response, he heard, "You too," but for some reason in a man's voice. So the young man quickly drew his sword and swung it back, because he thought that someone who could harm him was standing there. But he only sliced through the air. Then he decided to launch his knife, and it stuck in the wall a few meters away from Ian's face, who was standing calmly watching all the actions of his opponent. In addition, he folded his arms across his chest to show his attitude toward him. When the guest calmed down a bit, he asked the sorcerer who he was, because he had never met him before. However, Ian was not going to answer this question, but instead turned his gaze to Cecilia and said, "Did he kill her already?" And then he thanked her, because that would be one less problem in his life. And while he was saying this, ice began to appear at the feet of his opponent. He was climbing higher and higher on the limb with every passing second. Then a blond man began to move towards him, who addressed him by the name of Daniel and said that he was very lucky to meet him here. Then the sorcerer's eyes glowed with blue light, and he pulled his right hand back and said that he had long wanted to kill the young man with his own hands, but never had the chance. Daniel raised his hands in the air and asked them to wait, asking if it would be better to capture him alive, to be able to get some useful information later. But the thought flashed through the blonde's mind that it was now that he would be able to avenge all his friends. However, the opponent did not understand what kind of friends he was talking about. The sorcerer replied that it was still 10 years away. The ice continued to rise all over his body, and it had almost reached his face. And Ian continued to say that he had gone back in time and made a promise to himself. As soon as he noticed that the ice had already filled almost the entire body of the young man, he came closer to him and touched it with only one index finger, waiting for it to break and allow his opponent to breathe normally. However, these actions did not save his life, and he leaned against the wall with his head, or to be more precise, his forehead. Then a blond man approached him, and he put his hand on his neck and searched for the seal of mana, which would prove to the people who would see it that this young man also did not come here with good intentions. Suddenly, he heard the voices of people behind him, moving down a long, large corridor straight toward the direction where some bad things had just happened. Because of this, the blond man froze in place to think about his story for them. When people approached and saw him and the two bodies lying next to him, they stopped and stood there with bewildered expressions for a few seconds, processing what they saw. A man standing in the center turned to Ian Page with gritted teeth and asked what he was doing here, and what had happened here in the first place. The young man stood among the two dead and clenched his hands into fists. On the man's body, traces of a certain seal could be seen on his neck, symbolizing that he had worked with Cecilia. After a few hours, the head of the tower arrived at the estate and was already in a meeting with His Majesty, who banged his fist on the table and began to say that two people had already turned out to be spies. From the maid to the secretary, he asked how the magic tower could allow this to happen. However, without even allowing me to answer, he continued to ask questions about the fact that they had asked to transfer the investigation of Cecilia's identity to them, so why hadn't they checked anything? And he added angrily how he could trust the tower anymore. So he is forced to take away their right to investigate, because he had hoped for them, and everything did not go well. And he ordered them to immediately pass on all the information they knew about the case to the royal guards, and he asked if they understood him. The chief of the tower shook his head sadly and replied that everything would be as His Majesty ordered. Then the king began to hold his head, because it was already aching from thinking about what had happened and what would happen. So he said that the wizards could leave, because he had many things to do. Hearing these words, the tower's chief slowly bowed to show his respect. After that, the assistant loudly addressed Ian Page and invited him to come inside and bow before His Majesty. When the man saw him, he said sadly that they had met again. His expression showed fatigue and disappointment. Ian slowly entered the room and took a seat right in front of the main man, carefully folded his hands in front of him, and bowed down, looking down. The king got to his feet and said in a serious tone that thanks to the sorcerer's skills, they were once again able to protect the empire from spies, because if not for him, important, secret information would have fallen into the hands of the wrong people, and the secrets of the imperial family became available to the public. Then the man sat down comfortably in his luxurious chair and said that he would never leave the merits of faithful and responsible people unattended. So he wanted to reward him. At that moment, an assistant approached the guy with a large box, which he opened and offered to accept the gift. Inside was something beautiful and important. Namely, it was a robe belonging to the emperor's ancestor, Michael Greenriver. He was the only sorcerer of the imperial blood. Ian was very surprised by what he saw. The man went on to say that he shouldn't give it to non-members of the imperial family, but he decided that the sorcerer needed it now more than he would wait for some other opportunity. Therefore, the boy may believe that he has given it away for the rest of his life, or until he decides to give it up. After all, this is Michelle's clothing, the first and last sorcerer of imperial blood. He is the hero who saved the empire, the man who rose to the rank of tower owner as a sign that his magical abilities were recognized. Then the emperor asked Ian to put it on. Because it was worn over his clothes, there was no need to change. The young man stood there for a few seconds and thought about the offer. And yet, he decided to try it on. So when he put it on, all those present began to carefully consider how he looked in this outfit. The mustachioed gentleman said that his smile was a little too big, but one day it would be just right. Sooner or later, that moment will come. Then the young man realized the properties of the clothes. Then the sorcerer smiled sweetly and said that in the near future, he could adjust what was not fitting properly. And he used some kind of magic to do it. After that, the clothes shrank a little and became just normal. People who were present during this were quite surprised. They did not understand how he could do this. After all, they are not familiar with such magic. The emperor put his head on his hand and put his foot on his leg and said that Ian's clothes looked very nice, especially the color. Therefore, he was pleased that the boy decided to accept the gift. When he heard these words, the young man looked down and lowered his head, realizing that the attention of many people present was now focused on his person. He then bowed low and said that it was indeed a great honor to receive such a gift from His Majesty. He hadn't even counted on it. After all this, the sorcerer decided that it was time for him to return home. So he went out into the courtyard of the estate to take a seat in the carriage and leave immediately. However, on his way, he met a princess who was walking around the grounds with her friends. When she saw the boy, she addressed him by name and asked him to listen to her. When he got a little closer to the young lady, he began to slowly lower himself to bow and greet the princess. However, the girl stopped him, saying that he shouldn't do that. Her facial expression showed that she was a little nervous. She was also moving her fingers quickly, so she looked around and said that she really needed to talk to him about one thing. Ian lowered his head and looked down and said guiltily that he had been tactless that night. He apologized for his behavior. The blonde woman sharply replied that it was not like that at all. And so Ian put his index finger to his mustache and said quietly that he would keep her secret from everyone until she wanted to tell him about it. She doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Hearing these words, the woman simply blossomed because it had been preventing her from living and sleeping normally for several days. Having said that, Ian began to walk slowly past his interlocutor, for he was quite tired and wanted to go home to rest and see his mother. Suddenly, he was called by name by the prince, who quietly came up behind him. A second later, he added that thanks to him, the imperial estate and the empire itself had been saved from destruction. He added that, as his father said, the sorcerer is a real hero for them, because no one else was able to help them on such a difficult journey. Suddenly, the young man said that he had forgotten to introduce himself, but perhaps Ian already knew about him, so it might not be necessary. When the sorcerer took a closer look, his eyes grew several times larger with surprise. The blond man put his right hand on his heart and said with a big smile on his face that he was the 5th prince of the empire, and his name is Ragnar Greenriver. And then the memory of how the prince himself had poisoned him in his past life came to him. He was also his best friend at the time. And now he's standing there calmly looking at him and doesn't realize that when they were experiencing bright moments. But the blond man could not hide his emotions because these memories were very painful for him. Because at that moment, he experienced very tough emotions. Then the 5th prince smiled sweetly and put his hands behind his back and said that it might be too late, but he wanted to congratulate Ian on the recognition of the ivory tower. At this time, the thought flashed through the sorcerer's mind that he did not remember Ragnar as young as he was. The latter continued to say that he really wanted to express his personal gratitude for protecting the empire from spies. Then the gentleman moved his right hand forward and said that he wanted to invite the boy to dinner. Paige thought about this invitation for a few minutes because it could change the course of further events. The prince could not wait long for an answer, so he asked what his interlocutor would say. After all, he still had many things planned for that day, and as soon as the sorcerer was about to answer, the princess came in ahead of him and told Ragnar that she and Mr. Ian already had plans. The prince closed his eyes with a sweet smile because the sun was shining in them, and he asked if it would be possible to meet tomorrow because he really wanted to talk to the boy in the near future. But the sorcerer lowered his head and looked down and addressed His Majesty and asked for forgiveness and refused because he had many things to do immediately. Ragnar, hearing this answer, said briefly and clearly, "Well, that's understandable." The princess was very angry that everything was going to turn out this way. The reason was that she hadn't had a proper rest for several days. The gentleman then bowed to Ian and said that in that case, he had to go to his scheduled meeting, where he was already waiting. Finally, he added that he was very glad to see the young man. The sorcerer continued to stand in his place, for he was simply shocked by Rangar's behavior, for he was used to a completely different attitude. As the prince and his assistants walked, the sorcerer watched him, with the princess still standing by his side. She wanted to get a more accurate answer, and as soon as they left, these two were able to exhale and finally feel a little freer, because this gentleman made them tense up. A second later, this silence was broken by a young lady who addressed herself to Ian and said that she didn't really want to interfere, but her emotions got the better of her. The interlocutor replied that it was no big deal, and at that moment, the thought flashed through the sorcerer's mind that he and Ragnar had met 2 years earlier than in his previous life, and he was still hiding his intentions. But the blonde realized that he would ruin these plans before he had time to increase his influence in the empire, because the later it was done, the harder it would be. And then this fifth prince won't be able to make any headway, and Ian will only be happy to watch you fall into hell. And from that moment on, they are on opposite sides. And now, 5 years have passed. These events take place in the same estate where they took place a few years ago. Everything is the same as it was. In one of the offices, one of the princes was sitting with his head on his right hand, looking intently at a red-bound book and saying that he really didn't understand anything. And I started to get angry. Why can't it be explained in a simple way? And who writes such heavy books in general? A librarian who was passing by at that moment said that these books were written by the first emperor. They list all the qualities necessary for the future emperor, and which he should master in the near future. This made him very upset, because for him, it was just a group of unrelated words. And then the man added that the prince needed to read all these books, more specifically about history, culture, economics, politics, and so on. Hearing this, he closed his eyes and replied, I don't know. He said that today was not a good day for reading. The librarian said in a serious tone that His Majesty would be angry if he didn't read anything again this time. But this did not affect the boy at all. Instead, he turned his head towards the vice captain and asked him if today was the last battle between the captain and Ian. The assistant turned his head to his boss and replied briefly and clearly, "That's exactly what he said." After all, this is a very grand event for the empire. Hearing this answer, the prince said that he definitely needed to see it with his own eyes. He quickly got to his feet, leaned on the table, and invited his assistant to go to the place of the fight. At this time, the training ground of the 2nd Detachment of the Imperial Knights was preparing for a very important battle that would be watched by a large number of people. The black-haired knight, holding his sword in his hands, took a deep breath and slowly exhaled, and then said quietly to himself that this was his last chance. And mistakes here are simply impossible to make, because they can be fatal, and they can also cross out his entire life experience. But there was no way to give up. And while he was thinking about it, many sharp ice flows flew at him. As soon as he saw them, he began to run away from where he had just been standing. Then he stopped abruptly, and it happened in such a way that he even had to brake with his feet on the sand. Having made such an abrupt stop, he turned his head and sighed to the attacker. When the knight saw him a few meters away amidst the rising dust cloud, he decided to run straight for him without hesitation, because he needed to demonstrate his courage at least somehow. In order to shorten the distance and get closer, he pushed off the ground and then from a sandy rock on the right side. After this stunt, he landed on one knee, leaning his sword on the ground to keep from falling. And this landing took place quite close to the opponent. Then he looked up to assess the situation, because he needed to understand how to proceed. And the knight realized that the sorcerer was preparing another attack. And that's exactly what happened. Ian used fire magic and created a big, fiery orange ball that was hard to get close to because it was too hot. So the black-haired boy had to stand there for a few seconds, doing nothing but staring at her, because he realized that he could not defeat her on his own. But after thinking about it for a long time, he decided to try, because doing nothing would only lower his authority. So he shouted, "Ah!" and swung his sword. After the first strike, he thought he had managed to touch the ball, and he was very happy about that, because not everyone would have dared to do that. So the young man began to slowly use his sword to fight his way into the depths of this object, because that was where his opponent was, who, as it turned out, was standing silently in the center with his hands down, watching calmly, because at any moment he could use a new kind of magic. And the knight had to make a lot of effort to finally reach it, and as soon as he succeeded, he shouted, "Ah!" again while taking the last few steps. And then he put the sword to the opponent's chest and pressed a little on it so that he went inside. At this time, the blonde sorcerer did not try to prevent this. However, everything did not turn out as the boy had imagined. After all, in just 1 second, the sorcerer was standing behind the knight and stretched out his hand to tap him on the shoulder. And when the black-haired man realized this, he began to slowly turn his head back, saying sadly that he had not been able to touch the sorcerer even for a split second. Hearing this, the sorcerer began to smile and move his hand back and forth. During these 5 years, he changed a lot, grew older, and grew long blonde hair. He went on to say that the knight had managed to wound him right in the heart, and if it hadn't been for the illusion, he would have died long ago. So this is already a pretty good result. Then Ian came closer and shook hands with his opponent, and the latter thanked him for the training. The sorcerer replied that it was his payment for the chain he had received. The black-haired man began to smile sincerely, for he was pleased to be able to spend so much time in the company of this young man. And he said that he had gotten much more than that. Ian put his right hand to his chin and agreed, saying that the knight's skills were not the same as they were 5 years ago. He had even learned to survive his attacks. Then the knight lowered his sword to the ground and asked in a serious tone if he could ask a question. The sorcerer said that of course he could. The black-haired man did not hesitate to ask what level the sorcerer had already reached. The man had not expected to receive such a question, so he was quite surprised, because no one had ever asked him that before. And he answered with a sincere smile that he was actually not as big as it might seem at first glance. After all, he knows a lot of different magic that can be used in the East for his level. It turns out that he is a 5th grade master. And then a memory flashed through his mind that in his previous life, he was able to reach the 6th grade only at the age of 26. And although the pace of development is excellent, he still did not manage to become a 6th grade wizard, because of the speed of development of the body and the growth of the mana's heart, which cannot be increased. Therefore, at the moment, he has a 5th grade education. However, he cannot give up hope of becoming stronger. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the prince, who said, "Wow, this is the best sorcerer and the best knight in the empire." At these words, the two men turned their heads in the direction of the speaker. Ian saw their guest and said, "His Majesty." And he in turn came closer and spread his arms to the side and said that he heard that they were having a battle today. The prince then folded his hands as if in prayer and asked if they would like to have breakfast together. That way, they could celebrate their and his unbridled desire to get better. The sorcerer looked down and apologized, and said that today his training in the tower would end, and he would be officially admitted to the duties of the arch-sorcerer. Therefore, he needed to meet with the owner of the tower. The prince was very upset by these words, because he had hoped to take a little time off from school in this way. With a sad expression on his face, he replied that he understood, because they could not do anything about it. Then the blond man put his right hand to his side and said that Ian could go, and they would eat some other time. The young man bowed and replied that he would hope to see him soon. And when he took 2 steps to the right, he put his right hand on his heart and said, "See you soon." And he immediately set off on his way to be on time for the solemn event. But he decided to use magic to move, because it would be much faster. So he pushed off from the ground and rose in the air, hovering for a few seconds above the 3 figures looking down at him. He smiled sweetly at them and said that he would try to return soon. After all, he himself wanted to get this status as soon as possible and be able to freely use his powers whenever he needed to. The knight, the prince, and his assistant all watched Ian with their heads held high for a few seconds until he disappeared from their view. Still looking up, the blond man said that thanks to the mantle his father had given the sorcerer, he could fly. And at some point, he caught himself thinking that he was even envious, somehow. Then the prince turned his head to the right and sharply turned to the captain, who quickly put his hand on his heart and bowed and waited for further instructions from the chief. The other man asked him if their training was over, because what could the man say about it? The black-haired man looked down and said that he had noticed 2 things. The first is that he could not touch Mr. Ian with all his will, and the difference in strength between them will only increase every year. The blonde stood silently and tried to listen carefully, because this was very important information for him. And his captain continued to say that he could confirm with all certainty that he could definitely defeat the other sorcerers. Immediately after he said this, the young man smiled, for no matter how tired he was enjoying it. And just a few minutes into his flight, Ian was already near the ivory tower. An hour later, he arrived exactly when he was supposed to. He slowly opened the door inside and cautiously entered. The one who was already there said happily, "You've come just in time. I was just preparing for our meeting." Then the owner of the tower leaned on his desk and said that he kept thinking back to the day when he was told about the talented boy in the south and came to this tower to meet him. And the man, closing his eyes a little, added that it seems like very little time has passed, but he is already standing in front of him as a mature and courageous young man who has already achieved a lot. This means that he himself will grow even older. Ian was very amused by these words, so he smiled sweetly and replied that the owner of the tower still has to live and live. After a few minutes, the gentleman picked up a couple of sheets of paper and rereading the text on them said that everything here was written perfectly because he saw compliments and various praise. He added that the boy's appearance was a gift to the tower and the entire empire. Newly minted sorcerers try to follow his example because he is literally a walking instruction manual on how to be a perfect sorcerer. The young man really liked hearing such words in his direction, but he still asked me not to praise him and the capabilities he was capable of. The owner of the tower said that they would soon find out whether he was praising it or not. Today, as he knows, is the last day of school. An ordinary student at the academy would have a ceremony and then be sent to the village to take mana tests. However, his case is unique. The man asked him how he felt about spending this day talking to an old man. Ian smilingly replied that he would be honored. The mustachioed gentleman began to put his things on the table so that there would be no chaos when he returned. And as he did so, he said that he understood that this was the way to respond, but he would still thank you for such kind words. Finally, the owner of the tower took out a plaque and handed it to the young man, congratulating him on being considered a real wizard from now on. He can show this sign to any corner of their empire, and everyone from soldiers to ordinary citizens will have to listen to him. In the future, this may come in handy often. Holding it tightly in his hands, the boy asked if his help as a full-fledged sorcerer was needed somewhere else. The chief, looking at him intently, answered him with a question. "What do you think?" Then he folded both limbs across his chest and said that they really do not have enough workers. After all, they had lost Halen, and there was no one to take over her duties. He added that he did not want to rush Ian, but he would be very grateful for any help. Ian looked at his interlocutor and said that he would try to help in any way he could. The main thing is to get some rest now because these trainings have tired him out. The mustachioed man said that he would accept any of his decisions because he was already the chief archmagician of the tower. However, he must remember that great expectations are placed on him. But since it was his first time, he could choose where he wanted to go. And the owner of the tower used magic to show a long list of places where help is needed. Rodmere Province is the largest seaport in the empire. Benson Province is the largest iron producer in the empire. And the last place is Perik Province, where he conducted mana tests in his past life. Some sorcerer died on this mission, so he was sent to replace him. So he clearly said that he wanted to go to the province of Perik. Hearing this answer, the owner of the tower looked down and said that this province needed the help of a sorcerer the most. And a second later, he began to tell me that they had already sent 2 third-class sorcerers and imperial knights, but the problem remained unsolved, and it seems that the monsters of the Great Fields have taken the offensive. The man then held out a sheet and said that all the details were written here. Therefore, he can familiarize himself with them today and give his answer. After all, if he decided to refuse, he would have to find someone else. But Ian did not think long and study any information. He immediately answered that he would definitely go. When he returned home, it was time for dinner. And it was during this meal that he told his family that he was going to work in the province of Perik. And when the alchemist's son heard this, he stopped his meal and asked with wide eyes and mouth if he was sure he was going on his first mission to the province of Perik. He clarified that giant monsters were constantly raiding the land. Ian didn't like this reaction, so he banged the knife handle loudly. However, having mastered his emotions, he decided to put it on the table so as not to harm anyone. And then the question was raised by a mother who turned to her son and asked if it was really that dangerous. Ian turned his head to his mother and said in a calm tone that he thought things were not that bad, so a couple of months would be enough to sort everything out. The woman turned her gaze to the big table and asked with a sad expression if he would be going there in a week or a little later. And then she added that without him, this large estate would be completely quiet. The son smiled sweetly and said that he would try to return to her as soon as possible so that she would not be sad. The alchemist's son happily turned to the sorcerer, calling him captain, and asked if he wanted to see the elixir he had made himself before leaving. After all, he had tried very hard and might need it on the road. The father turned his head to the young man and addressed him by the name of Douglas and emphasized that he was already quite an adult. And maybe it's time to stop calling Mr. Ian captain. However, the guy did not understand what the problem was. After all, the captain is the captain. But if it causes someone any inconvenience, then he can. He paused for a moment, and everyone was waiting eagerly to hear what the young man would say. So Ian picked up a glass of water and took a few sips. And then in 1 second, he said one single word. Brother? Everyone was surprised, to put it mildly, because none of them expected to hear such a statement. And while everyone was shocked and trying to collect their thoughts, the young man smiled broadly and said once again, Brother Ian. And at that moment, the thought crossed the sorcerer's mind that this young man had been a criminal in his past life. The mother clapped her hands joyfully and said with a big smile that Ian now had a younger brother and she had a younger son. Ian did not like his mother's reaction, so he said angrily, Mother! The alchemist realized this and said in surprise, Mrs. Page, what are you? Then the man turned his attention to his son and told him to call the sorcerer Mr. Ian. The boy emphasized that they had grown up together. The father was not convinced, however, and said that this did not give him the right to speak like that. The young man replied that he would be useful to his brother and to this estate. The woman began to smile loudly, saying that he was indeed useful. So she did not understand what the problem was. And after the words were said, the lady continued to laugh. And her son, who was sitting on the right side, did not understand what was going on here, and perhaps there was a moment that he missed. Then he quickly got to his feet and stood there smiling sweetly for a few seconds, until finally everyone switched to something else entirely, because this topic was uncomfortable for everyone. And thinking about everything in the world, Ian realized that such a life is not bad at all. After all, in his past life, he could only dream about it. Therefore, here you need to use all the opportunities that are given to you. The next morning, the sorcerer was already standing in the courtyard, wearing the cloak that His Majesty had given him. Those who saw him off asked him if he was sure he was ready to go. Then the alchemist asked if he would go to the province of Perik right away. The sorcerer replied that he would first stop by to say goodbye to the owner of the tower, and then he would go to the province of Ledian. Then he told the alchemist that he remembered where he had placed all the mana traps. The man smiled and said that of course he remembered everything. Finally, the gentleman said that he was willing to give his life so that Ian's mother would be safe. The sorcerer looked down and said that he hoped they would be fine in his absence. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice shouting, "Brother!" loudly. When I got closer, I saw my father and Ian's reaction to this phrase, so I corrected myself and said, "Ah, I mean the captain." And he immediately held out his hands with a small flask of liquid in them, and he said that Ian already had his father's elixir, which was the same, but he had made it in his own way. Then he turned his gaze to the side and suggested that he was thinking that he will work much better than his father. That's why he suggests taking him with him. It was only because of this that Ian agreed to take this elixir with him. And after that, he decided that it was time to leave, because he had a long and difficult journey ahead of him. Although Douglas still needed to study for 3 years at the academy, his skills were recognized at the imperial level, and he was awarded the title of Imperial Alchemist. Holding the jar in his hands, Ian said that he was sure it would work well. Then the alchemist's son asked if he would fly to the province on his mantle. The blond man replied that he would rather take a carriage so as not to attract too much attention. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by the mother, who turned to Ian. The woman brought a small package, and handing it to him, she said that he should eat on the way, because she had prepared more to last longer. Then the young lady said that there was perishable food on top. The bottom was dried meat and dried vegetables, so he could keep them for later. And finally, she added that she also put his favorite bean pie. And after all this information, Ian looked at his mother and thanked her for her care. He would definitely eat everything. The woman began to take steps toward her son to hug him. Hugging him tightly, the woman asked her son to be very careful, then told him not to overwork and to eat well. Such tenderness on the part of his mother surprised the young man. He stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do at that moment. However, he pulled himself together and decided to hug her back. Then they held hands and stood looking intently into each other's eyes for a few seconds, because it was hard for them to let go of each other. And finally, Ian promised that he would be back soon, so she didn't have to worry. And as he approached the carriage, he turned to face his companions and said that it was time for him to go on his way, because he had already stayed here a little too long.